The day Victoria Hayes signed Nathan Brooks' termination letter, she was absolutely certain she was making the right call. She wasn't. 18 months later, she would be standing in a rain-soaked paddock, watching a car she'd never heard of tear through a field of million-dollar machines, and realizing, with a sick feeling settling deep in her chest, exactly who had built the engine screaming underneath that hood. This is the story of a single father who lost everything, rebuilt in silence, and made the entire industry stop and stare. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Nathan Brooks had a habit that drove his coworkers quietly insane. He smiled too much. Not the forced, performative kind that people paste on during morning meetings or when the boss walks by. No. Nathan's smile was the genuine, distracted kind. The kind that made people think he was somewhere else entirely, even when he was standing right in front of you, nodding along to whatever you were saying. It wasn't rudeness. It was just that his mind was always running two tracks at once. One track handled the conversation, the nodding, the appropriate responses. The other track was somewhere deep inside a mechanical problem he hadn't solved yet, usually involving combustion timing, heat dispersion, or the maddening relationship between torque and drag coefficient at speeds that existed, for now, only in his calculations. His daughter Lily called it his thinking face. "Daddy's doing the thinking face again," she'd announced to nobody in particular, whenever Nathan drifted off mid-dinner. She was 6 years old and had already developed the kind of patient resignation toward him that most spouses take years to cultivate. She'd reach across the table, grab a forkful of his pasta before it went cold, and eat it herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that waiting for Nathan to come back to earth was its own kind of skill. He wasn't a bad father. Anyone who knew him well enough would tell you that with zero hesitation. He was just complicated, built in layers. The outer layer was the engineer, methodical, precise, good at his job in the reliable, non-flashy way that keeps companies running but rarely gets anyone promoted. Beneath that was the single dad, exhausted in the bone-deep way that single parents everywhere recognize on sight, doing school lunches at 6 a.m. and bedtime stories at 9 p.m. and fitting everything else into the margins in between. And underneath all of that, running like a low-frequency hum through every waking hour, was the inventor. Restless, obsessive, chasing something he couldn't quite articulate but absolutely could not let go of. He'd been working at Meridian Motorsports for 6 years when Victoria Hayes walked through the front door and changed everything. Meridian Motorsports occupied a sprawling industrial building on the edge of a mid-sized city in the American Southeast, close enough to NASCAR country to feel its gravitational pull, far enough away to operate in relative obscurity. It had been founded in the early 90s by a guy named Gerald Whitmore, a former crew chief with the kind of mechanical intuition that bordered on supernatural and the business sense of a Labrador retriever. Gerald was beloved. Gerald was also, by the time Nathan joined, slowly running Meridian into the ground through a combination of stubborn tradition, bad contracts, and an absolute refusal to modernize anything that had worked adequately in 1997. The company survived on mid-tier contracts, designing and supplying engine components to smaller regional racing teams, doing some R&D consulting work, maintaining a small fleet of test vehicles. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid, and it employed about 60 people who showed up every morning because they genuinely loved what they did and didn't know where else they'd go. Nathan fit in there like a puzzle piece that belonged to a different box, but happened to be exactly the right shape. He'd come from a mechanical engineering background, spent 2 years at a larger automotive manufacturer before the layoffs hit and sent him scrambling, and landed at Meridian through a mutual contact who told Gerald that Nathan was the kind of guy who won't make you rich but won't embarrass you either. Gerald had hired him based on that ringing endorsement, and Nathan had spent the next 6 years proving it partially accurate. He was good. Not brilliant, or rather, nobody at Meridian had any idea he might be brilliant, because Nathan had never given them reason to look past the surface. He did his assigned work with quiet competence. He showed up on time. He never started drama. He fixed problems without being asked and never complained when he wasn't credited. He was, in the vocabulary of middle management, a solid contributor. What nobody at Meridian knew What Nathan had told approximately 3 people in his entire life was that for the past 22 months, he had been building something in his head. Not just tinkering, not just daydreaming, actually building in the way that real invention works, obsessively, iteratively, filling notebooks that he kept locked in a fireproof box under his workbench, running calculations that spilled across his laptop at 11 p.m. while Lily slept in the next room. He called it, with the complete lack of flair that characterized most of his communication, Project Ember. The core idea was an internal combustion engine design that rethought heat recapture in a way that, if his numbers held up under real-world conditions, could produce a meaningful efficiency gain without sacrificing the raw power output that racing demanded. In simple terms, more speed, less waste, smaller margin for thermal breakdown during extended high-performance operation. In practical terms, the kind of advantage that would make every serious racing team on the continent want to know who built it. He'd never breathed a word of it at work, not because he was hiding it exactly, more because he knew how ideas like his got received in environments like Meridian. You talked about a big, half-finished idea before you could prove it, and the idea became a joke, a Nathan thing, a distraction. He'd seen it happen to other engineers, watched good instincts die in conference rooms because the person carrying them opened their mouth 6 months too early. So he waited. He calculated. He filled the notebooks. He smiled the thinking smile at dinner and let Lily steal his pasta and kept running the 2 tracks simultaneously, every single day, waiting for the moment when he'd have something real enough to show. He was still waiting for that moment when Gerald Whitmore sold the company. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning in early October via an all-hands email that arrived at 8:47 a.m. and emptied the break room of coffee conversation within approximately 90 seconds. Gerald was stepping back. The company had been acquired by a private investment group called Vantage Capital Partners, effective immediately. A new CEO would be installed to lead Meridian through what the email called an exciting period of strategic realignment, which was the kind of language that had been making people's stomachs drop since the invention of corporate euphemism. The new CEO's name was Victoria Hayes. Nathan looked her up the same way everyone else did: LinkedIn, a few industry articles, whatever came up in the first 2 pages of a search. What came up was impressive, and not in a way that felt particularly warm toward 60 people who loved their jobs and didn't move very fast. Victoria Hayes was 30 years old. She had an MBA from Wharton, a brief stint at a Formula One technical consultancy in Europe, and then 3 years as a turnaround specialist at Vantage Capital, where she had, by all accounts, successfully restructured 2 struggling manufacturing companies. The word restructured appeared in every article. It appeared the way that word always appears, as a polite container for something considerably less gentle. She walked into Meridian on a Thursday morning carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that managed to be completely neutral while somehow communicating that she had already formed preliminary opinions. She was medium height, sharp-featured, the kind of person whose posture alone told you something about how they operated. She introduced herself to the assembled staff briefly, said the right things about respecting the company's legacy and looking forward to understanding the team, and then got to work in a way that suggested the introductory pleasantries had been scheduled for exactly as long as she'd allowed them. Nathan's first one-on-one with her was 3 weeks after she arrived. He almost forgot about it and showed up 2 minutes late, which he could tell landed poorly even though she didn't say anything about it directly. Her office still had Gerald's furniture in it: worn leather chairs, a bookshelf full of racing memorabilia and technical manuals, a small model of a 1969 Dodge Charger on the windowsill that Nathan had always quietly admired. Victoria hadn't changed any of it yet, which he took as a sign that she was the kind of person who observed before she acted. Later, he'd realize he should have paid more attention to that. "Nathan Brooks," she said, reading from her portfolio rather than looking up when he sat down. 6 years with Meridian, senior engineer, engine systems and component design. That's right. You've been part of some projects that went over timeline. She said it the way someone states a fact rather than lodges an accusation, which somehow made it feel worse. The Hargrove contract ran long, yeah. There were some supply chain issues with— I've read the notes. She looked up then, and her eyes were very direct. Not unkind exactly, just precise. I'm not here to relitigate the past. I'm here to understand where we're going. She asked him a series of organized, methodical questions about his current workload, his assessments of departmental bottlenecks, his opinions on where Meridian was losing efficiency. It was a good interview. She was clearly smart and genuinely curious about the technical details in a way that some of the finance background executives he'd encountered were not. He answered honestly, probably more honestly than was strategically wise, because honesty was just his default setting, and he'd never fully figured out how to recalibrate it for politics. What he did not mention was Project Ember. He came close. There was a moment, she asked him, almost offhandedly, whether he thought Meridian had any untapped technical capability that wasn't being properly leveraged, and he felt the answer rise up in his throat the way a wave rises before it breaks. He swallowed it. Not the right time. Not yet. He needed another few months on the calculations. He needed to be certain. Probably some efficiency gains available in our testing protocols, he said instead. Victoria wrote something in her portfolio and moved on. He walked out of her office with the specific, quiet discomfort of someone who knows they've made a decision that they can't yet evaluate. Well, November came, then December. Nathan worked days at his desk at Meridian and nights in the cramped second bedroom of his apartment that he'd converted into something between an office and a disaster zone, where graph paper and printed simulations competed for surface area with Lily's artwork and the occasional abandoned crayon. His friend Marcus Webb had started asking questions. Marcus was the kind of friend that most people have one of if they're lucky. The kind who had known Nathan long enough to have no illusions about him and had made an affirmative choice to stick around anyway. They'd met in college, lost touch for several years, reconnected when Nathan's divorce was finalizing, and Marcus, who was going through his own rough stretch, had shown up at Nathan's apartment with a case of cheap beer and the willingness to sit there without requiring any particular conversation. Marcus didn't work in engineering. He ran a small automotive repair shop. Nothing fancy, just a solid neighborhood operation that stayed busy through word of mouth, and Marcus's fundamental belief that you should charge people fairly and actually fix what you said you were going to fix. He had a large garage attached to the shop with better equipment than most small operations, because Marcus spent money on tools the way some men spent money on boats. Nathan had told Marcus about Project Ember about 14 months in, on a Friday evening when they were sitting in the garage after the shop had closed, and Marcus had asked, not for the first time, what Nathan was always scribbling in those notebooks. Marcus had listened to the whole explanation with his beer resting on his knee and his eyes doing the thing they did when he was actually processing something rather than waiting to talk. "So you're saying it's better," Marcus had said when Nathan finished. "I'm saying if my numbers are right, it's significantly better." How significantly? Nathan had given him a specific figure, efficiency gain percentage, power retention comparison, and Marcus had looked at him for a long moment. "And nobody at your company knows about this." "Not yet." "Why not yet?" "Because I need to be sure." Marcus had accepted that with a nod, the way he accepted most of Nathan's stranger decisions. Not without reservations, but with the recognition that Nathan knew things Marcus didn't, and that waiting was sometimes the right instinct. "When you're ready," Marcus said, "the garage is yours." Nathan had thanked him and meant it more than the words came out carrying. January hit Meridian like weather. Victoria's restructuring plan went into effect in stages, and each stage left the building quieter. 3 people from accounting, then 2 from the fabrication floor, then a project manager named Darlene who had worked at Meridian for 11 years and cried quietly in the parking lot on her last day while her coworkers stood around not knowing what to do with their hands. The word streamlining was used frequently. It was used the same way realignment had been used in Gerald's farewell email, as a civilized wrapper around something with real human weight inside it. Nathan watched it happen and kept his head down and worked, which was what he always did when the environment around him got unstable. He focused on his current contracts, submitted everything on time, stayed out of the political currents that were visibly restructuring the social landscape of the office. He was polite to Victoria in the hallways. He attended the department meetings where she laid out her vision for Meridian's future, a vision that was coherent and serious and built almost entirely around cost reduction and contract consolidation with larger regional teams. Nothing in the vision included research into new engine technology. Nothing in the vision, as far as Nathan could tell, included the kind of long-horizon thinking that Project Ember required. He started to feel the deadline he'd been setting himself becoming urgent. In mid-January, he made a decision. He was going to tell her. He wasn't ready. He knew that. The calculations were 90% there, but not 100. The concept was solid, but untested by any physical prototype. He had nothing to show her except notebooks full of numbers and a very earnest explanation of why those numbers mattered. Everything in his cautious, methodical nature was screaming at him to wait, but he could feel the window closing. Another round of cuts was clearly coming. If he was going to make the case for Ember, he needed to make it before Meridian got any smaller, or before Victoria decided what Meridian was going to be and stopped being open to alternative arguments. He emailed her on a Wednesday and asked for a meeting. She confirmed for Friday afternoon. He spent 2 days preparing, organizing his notes into something presentable, printing out key calculations, rehearsing explanations in the shower and on his commute until they were as clear and non-technical as he could make them without losing the substance. He left Lily with his neighbor, Mrs. Carver, on Friday morning and told her he'd be home by 6. He was not home by 6. The meeting did not go the way he had allowed himself to hope it might. It went, he would think later, almost exactly the way he'd feared it would go. The fear he'd been suppressing for 22 months. Victoria listened. She was attentive in the way that she always was. Fully present, eyes on him, not checking her phone, not letting her attention drift. She asked 3 or 4 technical questions that demonstrated she was actually engaging with what he was saying rather than waiting for him to finish. For about 15 minutes, he let himself believe that she was genuinely considering it. Then she said, "Nathan, how much company time has gone into this?" He had prepared an honest answer to this. "Some. I've tried to keep the majority of it in my own hours. There's inevitably some how much company resource. In terms of access to certain testing equipment and some raw material," he gave her the figure he'd calculated. It was not a large number in the context of a motorsports company. It was not a 0. Victoria wrote something down. "This is interesting work," she said. And he was experienced enough with certain kinds of praise to hear the buried tense of the sentence. Was. "The concept is genuinely creative, but I have to be honest with you about where Meridian is right now and where I need to take it. I understand the company is in a difficult... It's not just difficult. We're 18 months from potential insolvency if current trends continue." She said it plainly, without drama. That was one of her qualities. She didn't dress up bad news. He would have respected it more in other circumstances. "My mandate is stabilization first. Every dollar and every engineer hour needs to be producing measurable, near-term return. What you're describing is minimum 2 years of development before you'd have anything testable in a real performance environment. Best case. I think that timeline could compress significantly if we... And what happens if the core assumption doesn't survive physical prototype testing?" She wasn't being cruel. That was the hardest part. She was being logical, the way a surgeon is being logical when they tell you something you don't want to hear. "We've spent 2 years and significant capital chasing an idea that turns out to have a fundamental flaw we couldn't see in calculation. Where does that leave us?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "My calculations don't have a fundamental flaw," he said. He said it quietly. He was not a man who made that kind of statement easily, and she seemed to hear that it cost him something. "I believe you believe that," Victoria said. And there it was. The sentence that would echo in his head for a long time after. Not unkind, not dismissive, completely devastating in its careful distinction between his conviction and her confidence in it. "I need to make a decision about resource allocation," she continued, "and I need every team member fully committed to contracts that are generating current revenue. I can't have a senior engineer split-focused. I've never let it affect my core work." "Your output has been fine," she acknowledged, "but fine isn't going to be enough going forward. I need people who are completely in." She paused. "I'm sorry, Nathan. I don't think this is the right fit going forward." He heard the words, processed them with the mechanical part of his brain, and something very still and very cold settled into his chest. "You're terminating my position," he said. "I am, effective end of the month. HR will walk you through the severance details." She was already reaching for something on her desk. professional to the end. The meeting was, as far as she was concerned, essentially complete. Victoria. He didn't usually use her first name. Something made him use it now. She looked up. The project, Ember. The notebooks are my own work. The IP, I'll have legal review what was developed on company time and resource. She said it gently but clearly. I'm sure we can reach a fair determination. He stood. He gathered his printed pages, his careful 2 days prepared presentation that had not moved anything, and held them against his chest the way you hold something that turns out to be lighter than you thought. I hope the company does well, he said. He meant it. That was the thing. He genuinely meant it. He walked out of her office and down the hallway and through the main floor where people were still working and didn't know yet. And he pushed through the glass door into the January cold and stood in the parking lot for a long moment, breathing. His phone showed a text from Mrs. Carver. Lily asked when you're coming home. She wants to show you something she drew. He looked at the text for a while. Then he got in his car and drove home. The weeks that followed had a specific texture that he would struggle to describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it. The strange, hollow quality of days that used to have structure and no longer did. He'd spent 6 years moving to the same rhythm, and the absence of it felt physical, like a sound that stops so suddenly you keep hearing the shape of it. The financial reality arrived faster than he was fully prepared for, which was his own fault. He'd known the termination was coming from the moment she said, I can't have a senior engineer split-focused, and he'd spent the remaining weeks doing his job and not making any practical preparations because practical preparations felt like conceding something he wasn't ready to concede. Stupid, maybe. But grief makes people stupid in specific ways. Severance covered 2 months. He had savings, but not the kind of savings that absorbed a major disruption without consequence. He had Lily's school, Mrs. Carver for childcare when he was working, the apartment, the car payment, all the interlocking pieces of a life that had been assembled around the assumption of income. He updated his resume. He sent it to contacts. He applied for positions at 3 companies he knew and 2 he didn't. Engineering jobs existed. He was employable. He kept telling himself that. At night, after Lily was asleep, he opened the notebooks. He hadn't stopped. He couldn't stop. Even in the week of the termination, even in the worst of the financial panic, he kept running the calculations, kept chasing the thing that didn't work yet, the variable that didn't resolve cleanly no matter how he approached it. There was a heat dissipation issue in the secondary combustion cycle that he had been circling for months, approaching from different angles. And every time he thought he had it cornered, it turned out to have more dimensions than he'd accounted for. It was maddening. It was on the bad nights, completely hopeless feeling. He would sit at the small desk in the cluttered room and look at the same equation he'd been staring at for 4 months and feel the very specific despair of a person who knows they are close to something important and cannot find the last step. On a Friday in late February, he called Marcus. I need the garage, he said. Marcus didn't ask questions. Keys are under the blue toolbox on the left. When do you need it? Monday. It's yours, Nathan exhaled. Marcus, Monday, Marcus said. I'll have the lift cleared. He hung up and sat for a while in the quiet apartment, Lily breathing softly in the next room, the notebook spread across the desk in front of him. Outside the window, the city did what it always did, moved around its business without noticing or caring about any particular person's specific private crisis. He picked up a pencil. He started working. He had told one other person about Project Ember. Her name was Diane Okafor, and she had been, the head of performance testing at Meridian. They were not close friends exactly, closer to the specific category of colleague that forms between 2 people who are both genuinely serious about the same technical problems and have spent enough time working near each other that a layer of real mutual respect has developed beneath the professional surface. Diane was exceptional at her job, in a way that was somewhat obscured by the fact that she presented herself with almost deliberate plainness. She wore the same rotation of practical clothing, kept her desk scrupulously organized, spoke in short sentences that contained almost no verbal padding. She was the kind of person who had probably been described as quiet her entire life by people who had mistaken precision of expression for absence of inner life. She had survived the first 2 rounds of Meridian cuts, which Nathan had taken as evidence that Victoria was at least smart enough to keep the people who were genuinely irreplaceable. On a Tuesday evening in early March, Nathan's phone rang with her number. He almost didn't answer. He'd been in the middle of something, the pencil moving, but some instinct made him pick up. "I heard you're gone," she said without preamble. 2 months now. "Still on the Ember thing?" "Yeah." A pause. "There's something from the February thermal testing that I think you'd want to see." His hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of something?" "The kind that I'm not supposed to share with someone who no longer works here." Another pause. "But I've been looking at your departure and looking at the testing data, and I have a feeling about something." "Diane, don't tell me not to," she said. "I've been running these numbers for 3 days. Either I'm wrong, or the thing you were trying to solve about the secondary cycle, I think I found something." He sat very still. "Can you send it encrypted?" he asked. "Already drafted the message. I just needed to know you still cared enough to want it." "Of course He stopped. He didn't have words for what he felt in that moment that weren't too large for a phone conversation. "Thank you, Diane." "Don't thank me yet. I might be wrong." She wasn't wrong. He stayed up until 3 a.m. with her data spread across his screen and his notebooks and the pencil moving so fast he broke 2 leads. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, the last stubborn variable resolved itself with such sudden clarity that he actually sat back and laughed, a short, surprise sound that came out almost like a cough. Lily appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, squinting. "Daddy, it's nighttime." "Yeah, sweetheart, go back to sleep." "Why are you laughing?" He looked at her, this small person who had eaten his pasta and waited patiently through the thinking face and grown up watching him chase something she was too young to understand. "I think I figured something out," he said. She considered this. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone reserving judgment. She shuffled back toward her room. "You should sleep too." In a bit, he turned back to the notebooks. He had the answer. After 26 months of calculation and obsession and failure and trying again, he had the answer. Now, he just had to build it. Bam. The next morning, he drove to Marcus's garage with 3 notebooks and a printout of Diane's testing data and a thermos of coffee that he'd made too strong and didn't care. Marcus was there, opening up the shop, and he looked at Nathan's face and said, without any preamble, "You got something." "I got something." Marcus nodded slowly. "How big?" Nathan thought about how to answer that. He thought about the numbers, the resolution of the secondary cycle problem, the efficiency projection that had been theoretical for more than 2 years and was now, for the first time, something he actually believed. "Big enough," he said. Marcus handed him a set of keys. "Shop's yours until 9 every morning. After that, I need the lift for customers. You can use the backspace any time." Nathan took the keys. They were warm from Marcus's hand. "I'm going to need to buy some materials," Nathan said. "I've got some savings, but we'll figure it out," Marcus said. "Marcus, I said we'll figure it out." He said it in the way that closed the topic without being unkind about it. "Go look at the space. Tell me what you need moved." Nathan walked into the garage alone. It smelled like motor oil and cold concrete and something metallic and clean underneath. The morning light was coming through the high windows in long diagonals, hitting the dust in the air and making it visible. He stood there for a moment just breathing it in. Then he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The first prototype was ugly. That was the only honest word for it. Nathan stood back and looked at what 3 weeks of work had produced and felt something between pride and embarrassment. The way a parent feels looking at a child's first attempt at something difficult. You can see the effort in every imperfect line, and the effort means something, but you're also aware that it has a long way to go. It sat on Marcus's workbench like a mechanical argument, mismatched components sourced from 4 different suppliers, held together in places with fittings that worked but didn't match, annotated in Nathan's handwriting on strips of masking tape because he hadn't gotten around to a proper labeling system yet. The secondary combustion assembly was jury-rigged in a way that made Marcus, who had come over to look on a Saturday morning with 2 coffees, tilt his head and say nothing for a long moment. "Go ahead," Nathan said. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Marcus scratched the back of his neck. It's a lot of tape. The tape is temporary. Uh-huh. Huh? Marcus handed him one of the coffees. How's it run? I haven't run it yet. You've been here 3 weeks. I've been building it for 3 weeks. Running it is different. Running it means finding out if something fundamental is wrong. Nathan wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I needed to get it right first. Marcus looked at him with the particular expression he'd developed over 20-some years of friendship for moments when Nathan was doing the thing where he intellectualized a fear into something that sounded like caution. He didn't push it. He just drank his coffee and waited. Nathan ran it the following Tuesday. He did it at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before the shop opened, in the gray early light with the garage doors cracked just enough to manage exhaust. He'd set up a basic monitoring rig on the bench across from the prototype. Nothing sophisticated, just enough instrumentation to capture the critical data points he needed to evaluate. His hands were steady when he made the final connections. His hands were always steady when he worked. It was the rest of him that had trouble. He stepped back. He checked the connections one more time. He looked at the notebook open on the workbench beside him, the final version of the ignition sequence mapped out in blue pen. He started it. The sound it made was rough, much rougher than it would eventually be with proper tolerances and matched components, but that wasn't what he was listening for. He was listening underneath the roughness, trying to hear the behavior of the cycle itself, the way the secondary combustion was handling the heat load, the point at which the thermal signature would tell him whether his solution to the problem actually worked the way Diane's data had suggested it might. He stood there for 4 minutes and 40 seconds, which was how long it ran before he shut it down to check temperatures and review the initial data capture. Then he sat down on a metal stool in the middle of the garage and put his face in his hands and stayed like that for a while. Not because it had failed, because it hadn't. The numbers on the monitoring rig, rough and preliminary as they were doing exactly what 26 months of calculation had told him they should do. The secondary cycle was handling the heat load. The efficiency curve was real. The thing he'd built from notebooks and stolen testing data and Marcus's garage in 3 weeks of 6 a.m. mornings was actually working. He called Marcus at 6:45. "It runs," he said. A pause. "That's it? That's all you're going to say?" "It runs the way I said it would run." Another pause. Longer. "Okay," Marcus said quietly. "Okay. Good. Yeah. You eating breakfast?" Nathan looked around the garage. He hadn't eaten anything. "No. There's a place 2 blocks over that opens at 7. Meet me there." They sat in a booth by the window, and Marcus ate eggs, and Nathan drank coffee and stared out at the street, and neither of them said very much. The silence was comfortable in the way that silence between old friends can be, full of things understood without being spoken. Nathan was processing something that didn't have language yet. Marcus seemed to understand that and let him process. Eventually Marcus said, "What's the next step?" "Refinement. The prototype is rough. I need proper components, better tolerances, a full testing environment, and I need to build a complete engine around it, not just the core assembly." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That's going to take time and money." "How much money?" Nathan told him. It was not a comfortable number. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I've got some set aside," he said. "Marcus, don't start. I'm not letting you put your savings into this." "My savings, my decision." Marcus picked up his fork. "And I'm not putting all of it in. I'm putting some of it in, and we're going to agree right now that I'm not a charity case and neither are you. And when this thing pays off, I get 20% of whatever the licensing deal looks like, which I fully expect to argue about after the fact." Nathan looked at him. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since you called me in February." Marcus shrugged, like the whole conversation was straightforward. "You're not going to do this alone. You can't do this alone. You know that." He did know that. He just hated knowing it. 15%, Nathan said. 18. 15. 17, and you buy breakfast. Nathan reached for the check that the server had left at the edge of the table. Done. Spring. In that part of the American Southeast comes on like a slow argument, warm one week, cold the next. never quite committing until late April when it suddenly decides and stays decided. By mid-April, Nathan had established a routine that would have looked, from the outside, more or less insane. He was up at 5. He made Lily's lunch the night before because 5 a.m. was not an hour during which he trusted himself with sandwich construction. By 5:30, he was at the garage. He worked until 8:15, drove back to get Lily up and ready, dropped her at school by 8:45, returned to the garage for the back section that Marcus kept clear for him. He worked through lunch most days, eating whatever he'd brought in a container without really tasting it. School pickup at 3:30, homework, dinner, bath, bedtime story. The uncompromising domestic schedule of a single parent who had no backup. Lily in bed by 8:30. Nathan back at the workbench in the apartment until midnight, sometimes later. It was too much. He knew it was too much. He was running on inadequate sleep and too much coffee, and the specific adrenaline of a person who can see the thing they've been chasing finally taking shape in front of them, and he knew that kind of fuel burns clean right up until the moment it doesn't. He got sick in April, a week-long respiratory thing that laid him out flat and made him furious at his own body for the interruption. He lay in bed with a fever of 101 while Mrs. Carver looked after Lily downstairs, and he had the notebooks propped against his knees and a pen in his hand until Lily appeared in the doorway with a glass of water and a look of small, serious concern on her face that was so much older than 6 years old that it stopped him completely. "Mrs. Carver says you need to sleep," Lily said. "I will in a bit." "You always say in a bit." "I mean it this time." She came over and climbed up on the bed beside him with the confident shamelessness of small children, pulling the notebooks off his knees and setting them on the nightstand without asking permission. "I'll sleep with you," she announced. "So you actually do it." He looked at her, this small person with her mother's dark eyes and his stubborn chin, and something in him went quiet in a way it didn't often get to be quiet. "Okay," he said. He was asleep in 6 minutes. He found out later from Mrs. Carver that Lily had stayed in the room for another hour, doing a coloring book, apparently under the impression that her presence was necessary for supervisory purposes. He told Marcus that story a few days later when he was back on his feet, and Marcus laughed so hard he almost choked on his drink. "Kid's going to run a company someday," Marcus said. "God help that company," Nathan said. But he said it the way you say something that you actually mean as a compliment. Chumma. The money situation reached its first real crisis point in early May. He'd been managing, barely, but managing. The severance had run out in March. He had one engineering consulting contract he'd picked up in February that was generating some income, but it was part-time work that paid part-time rates and was eating into the time he needed for Ember. His savings, combined with Marcus's contribution and a small amount he'd borrowed against the car, had covered the materials through prototype stage 2. But prototype stage 3 was a different order of magnitude. He needed a full engine block, custom machined components, and access to a dynamometer for proper performance testing. And the combination of those three things was requiring a number that he kept trying to think around and couldn't. He applied for 2 small business grants. One application was rejected within a week with a form letter so generic it barely qualified as a response. The other sat in processing limbo for 2 months. He went to 2 banks. The first loan officer listened politely to his pitch and then asked him with genuine puzzlement what collateral he was offering. The second was more direct. Without an operating business history and a physical prototype in a testable state, there was no basis for a loan. He was welcome to reapply once the project had demonstrated commercial viability. He sat in his car after the second bank and stared at the steering wheel for about 10 minutes. He wasn't built for asking people for things. This was not something he was proud of. It was just structurally true. He had grown up in a household where self-sufficiency was the primary virtue and need was something you managed quietly, and 20 years of adult life had not entirely unwired that. Asking Marcus for the garage had cost him something. Taking Marcus's financial contribution had cost him more, even though he knew Marcus had given it freely and would have been genuinely irritated to know Nathan still felt uncomfortable about it. Asking strangers at banks was a different category of humiliation entirely, not because the bankers were unkind, they weren't particularly, but because of the fundamental experience of having something you believed in absolutely and watching it mean nothing to people who required proof before belief, which was fair, which was reasonable, which was also completely defeating. He drove home. He made dinner. He helped Lily with a school project about state birds. She had North Carolina, which she considered deeply unfair because she'd wanted California. And he sat at the kitchen table with her glue stick and construction paper and felt temporarily better. Kids have a way of pulling you into the immediate that functions like a pressure valve. Whatever the larger disaster is, there's the glue stick problem right now, and the glue stick problem is solvable. After she was in bed, he called Diane. He didn't call Diane often. Their communication had been sporadic since February, cautious on her end because she was still at Meridian, and cautious on his end because he didn't want to put her in a difficult position. But he needed to talk to someone who understood the technical stakes, and Marcus, for all his value, capped out at a certain altitude on the engineering specifics. "How's it looking?" Diane asked, which meant, "How's the engine?" "Stage 2 is good. Really good. I need to get to stage 3 and I'm running into a capital problem." "How bad?" He told her the number. She was quiet for a moment. "You've talked to investors?" "I don't have the kind of connections that get you into rooms with real investors. And the project's not far enough along to be interesting to anyone who hasn't already seen what Stage 2 is doing." "What about motorsports people? Team owners? Technical directors? Who's going to take a meeting with a guy who got fired from a mid-tier engine company and wants to pitch them a new engine he built in a garage?" Diane was quiet again. It wasn't a silence of disagreement. It was the silence of someone who knew he was right and didn't have a comfortable counter. "Keep going," she said finally. "Find a way to keep going. That's the plan." "I mean it, Nathan. What's on that rig? What I saw in the February data, what you're telling me Stage 2 is producing. That's real. Don't let the money problem convince you the technical problem isn't solved. The technical problem is solved." He held on to that after he hung up. He held on to it the way you hold on to a specific thing when everything peripheral is falling away. Find a way to keep going. Okay? Okay? So how? Dikik. The solution when it came was inelegant and slightly absurd, which was consistent with how most solutions to real problems actually arrived. He sold the car. Not the good one. He'd already sold that 8 months earlier when the divorce finalization had required it. The one he sold now was the backup, a 10-year-old pickup truck he'd bought for $1,500 from a guy 3 neighborhoods over and used primarily to transport equipment. It was worth, after some negotiation, about $3,000 in its current condition, which was not the $3,000 he needed for Stage 3 materials, but was enough to get the next 4 weeks of supplies in the door. He started riding a bicycle to Marcus's garage in the mornings, which was fine until it wasn't fine, which was approximately the 3rd week of May when it rained 4 days in a row, and he arrived soaked every morning, and Marcus started leaving a dry towel on the workbench without comment, which was exactly the kind of friendship gesture that Nathan found more difficult to receive than overt generosity, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He also did something he'd resisted for months. He called his ex-wife. Sandra Brooks, Sandra Vasquez now, she'd gone back to her name, lived 2 hours away and had, by the terms of their arrangement, Lily every other weekend and 2 weeks in summer. Their divorce had been the kind that starts badly and ends with exhausted civility, the heat burning down to something manageable over 2 years. They were not friends. They were 2 people who shared a child and had arrived, through necessity, at functional coexistence. He didn't call her to ask for money. He was not there yet, and hoped not to arrive there. He called her because he needed Lily for 1 more weekend than his schedule allowed. There was a critical Stage 3 test he needed to run that Saturday, the kind that required his full concentration across 12 uninterrupted hours, and Mrs. Carver had a family commitment. Sandra picked up on the 3rd ring. "Nathan, not warm, not cold, just factual. Hey, I have a scheduling thing. I need an extra weekend, the weekend of the 24th. That's my mother's birthday." "I know, I'm sorry. Is there any flexibility? What's happening on the 24th? He considered how much to say. "A test I need to run. At the garage." A pause. "The engine thing." "Yeah." Another pause. Longer. Sandra had known about Ember in the abstract. He'd told her before the divorce, one of the last real conversations they'd had before the distance between them became structural. She hadn't been unkind about it, but she also hadn't exactly been encouraging, which was partly why he'd stopped talking about it. "You still doing that?" she said. "I never stopped." She made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or exasperation. It was hard to tell with her sometimes. "You got fired, Nathan." "I know I got fired." "And you're still building the thing she fired you over." "Yes." Silence. Then, "I'll take Lily the 24th, but you owe me a flexibility on the August schedule." "Whatever you need." "And Nathan—" She stopped. "What?" Just another pause. He could almost hear her deciding something. "I hope it works. The engine thing. I mean that." He wasn't sure what to do with that. "Thanks, Sandra." "Don't make it weird." She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he added the 24th to the garage schedule and went back to work. Stage 3 almost broke him. Not because it failed. In the crucial respects, it didn't fail, which was what made it almost worse. The full engine assembly performed. The efficiency numbers held. The heat dissipation through the secondary cycle was doing exactly what his math had predicted, which was a number that, when he compared it against the current industry benchmark for performance engines in this category, represented a genuine, significant, measurable advancement. The problem was the surface. The problem was the stuff around the core, the manifestation of the thing in physical components that had to function together under real-world racing conditions. Sustained high RPM over extended duration, thermal stress, vibration, the 100 variables that existed in an actual car on an actual track that a garage setup could only partially simulate. He found 3 separate issues in Stage 3 that required him to go back into the notebooks. 2 of them were solvable within a week. The third was a materials problem, a specific component in the exhaust management system that was not performing to the necessary tolerance under extended thermal load. He spent 11 days on it. 11 days of running tests, pulling the assembly, adjusting, rebuilding, running again. Marcus watched him from the doorway of the shop sometimes in the late afternoon, saying nothing, but present in the way that counted. Lily brought him drawings to put up in the garage. A race car. A fire. A picture of a man she identified as daddy working that featured what appeared to be a very large wrench and a determined expression. He tacked them to the wall above the workbench with electrical tape. On the 11th day, working at 11 p.m. in the back section of the garage, he found the materials adjustment that solved the exhaust issue. It was not an elegant solution. It required a component substitution that added cost and marginal weight, but it worked, and sometimes working is what you need the solution to do. He didn't laugh this time, the way he had after the first run. He just sat down on the floor with his back against the workbench and breathed for a while. The engine worked. Not perfectly. It would never be perfectly finished, not the way he'd imagined it in his best moments of abstraction. Real things were never the same as imagined things. There were rough edges, compromises, places where the physical reality of manufacturing had forced him to accept something less than the ideal. But it worked in the ways that mattered. The core innovation was intact and performing. The efficiency gain was real. The power-to-thermal management ratio was what he'd promised himself it would be 2 years and 4 months ago, when the whole thing had been nothing but numbers in a locked box under a workbench. He called Marcus. "It's done," he said. "The Stage 3? The engine, it's done," or "It's done enough." He heard Marcus exhale. Done enough for what? Nathan leaned his head back against the workbench. Above him, Lily's drawing of the man with the wrench looked down at him from the wall. "I need to find someone who can drive it," he said. The problem with finding a driver was the same problem he'd had with finding investors, with finding a bank, with every external-facing element of the past 5 months. He was nobody. He had no name in the industry, no team affiliation, no sponsorship that would lend credibility, no record of anything except 6 years at a mid-tier company that had subsequently let him go. If he cold-called racing teams and said he had a revolutionary engine that he'd built in a friend's garage, he would not be received warmly. He would be received the way well-meaning eccentrics always are, with cautious politeness and a fairly fast exit. He needed a different approach. He spent 2 weeks making calls through whatever contacts he could still access from his Meridian years. Former colleagues, contractors, suppliers who had their own networks. Most calls led nowhere. A few led to polite interest and no follow-through. One led to a name. The name was Danny Reyes. Danny Reyes was 34 years old and had spent the better part of a decade on the periphery of professional racing. Good enough to have competed at regional and some national-level events, not quite good enough, or not quite lucky enough with sponsorship, to have broken through to the top tier. He had a reputation as a technically precise driver, the kind that engineers liked because he could give you actual useful feedback about what a car was doing rather than just, "it felt fast," or "it felt loose." He was currently working as a driving instructor at a performance track 2 states over and competing in regional events when he could put together the entry fee. Nathan got his number from a former Meridian supplier who knew someone who had worked with Danny's previous team. He called on a Wednesday evening without rehearsing, which was maybe the right call because rehearsed pitches had not been serving him well. "Danny Reyes," he said when the call connected. "Yeah, who's this?" "My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm an engineer. I've built an engine that I think can compete at a high level, and I need a driver who's willing to take a risk on something unproven. I got your name from—" "From who?" Nathan told him. A pause. "Okay," Danny said. "Go ahead." So Nathan talked. He explained the project. Not the full technical breakdown, just the shape of it, what it was designed to do, what the Stage 3 numbers suggested it could achieve in a real performance environment. He talked about the efficiency curve and the power retention and what that meant in practical terms for sustained high-speed performance over a race distance. Danny listened without interrupting, which Nathan took as a good sign. Interrupters were hard to read. People who listened all the way through were usually either genuinely interested or building a polite way to decline. When Nathan finished, Danny said, "You built this in a garage?" "Yes. By yourself. Mostly, I had help with materials and space." "And you want to run it in competition. Regional series, there's a 4-stage event at Caldwell Raceway in October. I think the engine can be competitive." Competitive. Danny's tone was measured, not dismissive, but not excited. Against factory-backed teams. "Yes." Another pause. "What's the entry situation? Who's the team?" "Me. Potentially you. A friend who owns a garage and has become somewhat invested in this against his better judgment." He heard Danny make a sound that might have been a short laugh. "That's not a team, man. That's a liability." "I know what it looks like." "Do you?" "I know exactly what it looks like," Nathan said. "I also know what the engine does. I've been watching those numbers for 3 years. I'm not asking you to believe me without seeing it. I'm asking if you're willing to come and look." A long silence. Long enough that Nathan thought the call might be over. Then Danny said, "Where's the garage?" Nathan told him. "I can come the weekend of the 7th, Danny said. "If what you're saying holds up when I see it, we'll talk. If it doesn't, we shake hands and I go home and we never mention this conversation." "Fair," Nathan said. "I'm not agreeing to anything." "I understand." "And I'm not—" Danny stopped. "Okay. I'll see it. That's all. That's all I'm asking." After he hung up, Nathan sat for a moment in the kitchen, the phone on the table in front of him. From down the hall, he could hear Lily's sound machine. The rain setting she'd been insisting on since she was 4. White noise steady through the wall. He thought about October. He thought about Caldwell Raceway and factory-backed teams and what it would mean to put everything he'd built through that test, in public, without a single sponsor or investor or familiar name to stand behind him. He thought about Victoria Hayes signing a termination letter on a Tuesday morning in January, absolutely certain she was making the right call. He got up, washed his coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. He had a lot of work left to do. Danny Reyes arrived on a Saturday morning in a truck that had seen better years and a jacket that had seen better decades, and he shook Nathan's hand in the driveway of Marcus's garage with the particular grip of someone who is sizing you up and doesn't bother to disguise it. He was compact and dark-haired, with the kind of stillness in his body that experienced drivers sometimes develop, a comfort with waiting, with observing, before acting. He looked at the garage, and then at Nathan, and then at Marcus, who had materialized from somewhere inside and was holding a coffee. "Danny Reyes," Danny said. "Marcus Webb." Marcus handed him the coffee. "You want to look at the engine, or you want the tour first?" "Engine," Danny said without hesitation. So they showed him. Nathan walked him through the assembly with the same directness he'd have used with another engineer, not simplifying for an audience, but also not drowning him in numbers without context. He explained the primary design principle, the secondary combustion cycle, the heat recapture system, and what it did to the efficiency curve under sustained high-performance conditions. He showed him the Stage 3 data. He ran a bench test while Danny watched. Danny didn't say anything for the duration. He stood with his arms crossed and his eyes moving between the running assembly and the monitoring data with an expression that was unreadable in the way that certain people's faces are unreadable when they're genuinely thinking. When Nathan shut it down, Danny was quiet for a moment. "Run it again," he said. Nathan ran it again. When it stopped the second time, Danny uncrossed his arms and looked at the numbers on the monitoring rig. "That efficiency number," he said, "under sustained load. That's real," Nathan said. "That's not a bench anomaly. I've run Stage 3 47 times. That number holds." Danny looked at him. "You've been running this thing 47 times. I count." Danny looked back at the engine. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not the movie version of a man being converted by sudden revelation. Smaller than that. The private recalibration of someone who came in skeptical and has been given a reason to reconsider. "Caldwell in October," Danny said. "The Regional 4 stage." "Yes." "You know what the field looks like at Caldwell? Who's running?" "I know. Holcroft Motorsports fields 2 cars there, backed by Denner Industries." Danny said it the way you'd say a weather fact. Just information. "Those are factory-prepared machines. Budget we're talking about is 30 times whatever you've spent here." "I know. And you think this engine competes with that?" Nathan didn't hesitate. "I think this engine wins." Danny looked at him for a long moment. The garage was quiet except for the cooling tick of the engine and, somewhere outside, a car going past on the street. "I haven't driven a race in 8 months, Danny said. "You know that." "I know. And I'd be driving an untested car with an untested engine that some guy built in." He gestured at the garage. "Yes." "For what? Prize money in the story." "And because you'd be driving something nobody has ever driven before," Nathan said. "And because the numbers are real. And because—" He stopped. He almost said something about what it meant, about the months and the notebooks and Lily's drawings on the wall and the bicycle in the rain. He didn't say any of that. "Because I need someone good enough to tell the difference." Danny held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, at the engine, at the data still on the screen. "I want a week in the car before Caldwell," he said. "Proper track time, not a parking lot." "I can arrange that." "And I want to understand the engine, not drive blind. I want to know what it's doing, what it needs, where the limits are." "I'll teach you everything I know." Danny nodded slowly. It wasn't enthusiastic. It was the nod of a man making a calculated decision with incomplete information, which was, Nathan thought, exactly the right response. "Okay," Danny said. "We try." Marcus, who had been leaning against the far wall throughout this entire exchange with the careful neutrality of someone who knew when not to speak, let out a breath that had apparently been waiting a while. "Good," Marcus said. "Now, somebody tell me what we need to build a car around this thing, because I've got a contact at a salvage operation in Greenville who owes me a favor and I want to call him before he changes his mind about that." Nathan looked at him. "You already found a chassis?" "I found a potential chassis. There's a difference." Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "You two figure out the driver details. I'm going to go have a conversation about a 2019 spec frame that a man in Greenville tells me is in better shape than it has any right to be." Danny watched Marcus walk out of the garage, phone to his ear, already talking. Then he looked at Nathan. "How long have you known him?" Danny asked. 22 years. "He do everything this fast?" Nathan thought about Marcus showing up with beer during the divorce, about the key under the blue toolbox, about the dry towel on the workbench. When it matters, Nathan said. Danny looked at the engine one more time. Then he finished the coffee Marcus had handed him at the beginning, set the cup carefully on the workbench, and rolled up his sleeves. "Show me the data from Run 47, he said. "I want to see what happens at the top of the RPM curve." Nathan pulled up the notebook. They worked until the shop lights came on automatically at dusk, and neither of them noticed the time. The chassis Marcus found in Greenville was, as advertised, in better shape than it had any right to be. It was a 2019 spec frame that had been retired from regional competition after its previous team folded mid-season, not from mechanical failure, but from the far more common catastrophe of an investor pulling out 6 weeks before a race. The frame itself was structurally sound, the suspension geometry intact, the roll cage solid. It needed work, but the kind of work that Marcus's garage was equipped to handle. New brake lines, a full suspension refresh, bodywork on the rear quarter that had been sitting damaged since a paddock incident nobody had bothered to document properly. Marcus negotiated the price down to something that made Nathan uncomfortable in the direction of gratitude rather than expense, and had the chassis delivered on a flatbed on a Tuesday in late July with the particular satisfaction of a man who enjoys a good deal the way other people enjoy a good meal. Danny drove down from his driving school the following weekend, and the three of them spent 2 days in the garage doing the kind of assessment that only makes sense if you already know you're committed, measuring, checking, arguing in the specific technical shorthand that develops between people working toward the same thing. Danny had opinions about suspension setup that differed from Nathan's initial instincts, and they went back and forth about it with the productive friction of two people who each knew something the other didn't. "You're thinking about the engine output," Danny said, lying on his back under the chassis, his voice slightly muffled. "I'm thinking about what the driver feels at 140 coming out of a long bend. Those aren't the same problem." "I know they're not the same problem," Nathan said from the other side. "But if we soften the rear setup to what you're describing, we lose some of the efficiency advantage on corner exit acceleration. You lose it if I'm fighting the car. You keep it if the car feels right and I can actually use the power available." Danny rolled out and sat up, looking at Nathan directly. "I've driven over-engineered setups. Car does everything the engineers want it to do, and the driver spends the whole race trying not to get killed by it." Nathan thought about that for a moment. He hated when the other person was right about something he should have already accounted for. "Split the difference," he said. "We run it at your setting in practice, we collect the data, and we adjust from there." Danny considered this. "Fine. But you listen to what I'm telling you from the car, not just the numbers, what I'm actually saying." "I'll listen." "Swear to it, because engineers don't always listen." "I'll listen," Nathan said. "I used to be married. I have some practice." Marcus, who had been sitting on a toolbox eating a sandwich and monitoring this exchange, made a sound that was technically a cough. The chassis work took 3 weeks of evenings and weekends. Marcus contributed labor with the quiet efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed the mechanical problems, and who had a gift for fabrication that Nathan hadn't fully appreciated until he watched him rebuild the rear suspension components with a precision that would have been impressive in a professional shop, let alone a garage operation. Nathan installed the engine in mid-August. The installation itself took 2 full days, not because it was mechanically complex beyond his capability, but because he kept stopping to check things he'd already checked, running through the integration points between his engine design and the existing chassis systems with the particular anxiety of a person who has bet everything on something he built himself and is now confronting the full implication of that bet in physical form. Danny was there for the second day. He sat on a stool off to the side and didn't interfere but also didn't leave, which Nathan found oddly steadying. At one point, around hour 9, Nathan sat back on his heels and stared at the installed engine and said nothing for about 2 minutes. "You're second-guessing something," Danny said. "I'm checking something." "You're second-guessing something. You've checked that coupling 3 times. Nathan looked at him. "If this doesn't work..." "It works. You don't know that yet." "No," Danny said. "But you do. I've seen the data. I've watched you run that engine 40-some times in a controlled environment, and it does exactly what you say it does every single time. That doesn't change because we put it in a car." He paused. "What changes is that now we find out what we don't know yet. And that's supposed to be scary. That means it's real." Nathan looked at the engine in the chassis, this thing that had been notebooks and calculations, and 3 a.m. kitchen table work, and a fever, and Marcus's dry towels, and Lily's drawings on the wall, installed now, real, actual, waiting. "Okay," he said. He finished the installation. They first ran it in the car 4 days later, in the empty parking lot of an industrial park 2 miles from Marcus's shop, at 6 a.m. on a Sunday when the lot was unoccupied and the security guard Marcus had spoken to looked the other way in exchange for a reasonable understanding that nothing was going to be damaged. Danny took it through 4 careful passes at increasing speed. Nothing close to race pace, just enough to feel the engine's behavior under load in an actual vehicle. To check the integration, to listen for anything that wasn't right. Nathan stood at the edge of the lot with a radio and a clipboard full of data points he was tracking by ear and by the limited telemetry they'd been able to wire in on short notice. After the 4th pass, Danny brought it back and climbed out and stood next to Nathan, and they both looked at the car for a moment. "The power delivery is different than I expected," Danny said. Nathan's stomach dropped about 2 inches. "Different how?" "Smoother. The curve it doesn't spike the way I'm used to. It builds differently." He looked at Nathan. "That's the secondary cycle thing." "Yes. So when I push through the mid-range, instead of getting that surge and then managing the tail, you get a more sustained push through the full range, less peak spike, more extended performance window." Danny nodded slowly. "That's going to change how I drive it." "Is that—" Nathan stopped. "Is that a problem?" "No." Danny said it with the flat certainty of someone who has spent 15 years reading cars through the seat of his pants. "It's an advantage. I just need to retrain my instincts for it." He looked at the car again. "I need more seat time." They got him more seat time. The arrangement Nathan had managed, through 2 connections and a fair amount of persistent calling, was access to a small private test track about an hour and a half outside the city. A simple 2-kilometer loop used primarily by a regional driving school, available for rental on weekday mornings when the school wasn't running sessions. It was not a sophisticated facility. There was no timing equipment Nathan could access directly, no pit lane infrastructure, no spectators. There was a track and a car and a driver and an engineer, and that was what they had. They ran there 6 times between late August and mid-September, and each session built on the last the way learning actually works. Not in straight lines, but in fits and consolidations. Danny getting progressively more comfortable with the engine's power character, Nathan collecting data and making small adjustments, and sometimes making medium adjustments that Danny would assess on the next run and tell him in flat, precise language what had gotten better and what had gotten worse. Nathan learned that Danny's feedback, once you understood his vocabulary, was extraordinarily accurate. When Danny said the car felt heavy on entry, the data consistently showed exactly the oversteer condition he was describing. When Danny said the power wasn't there when I needed it, the telemetry would show a brief delivery hesitation at a specific RPM range that Nathan could trace and address. He was, in the vocabulary of engineering, an excellent data source with functioning self-awareness, rare and valuable. Their communication improved session by session, not toward warmth exactly. Danny was not a particularly warm person by disposition, and Nathan had never been skilled at the social dimensions of professional relationships, but toward the specific functional trust that develops between 2 people working in real time on something that requires both of them to be right. On the 5th session, Danny ran a series of laps that produced numbers that made Nathan stop writing mid-note and look up. He did the calculation twice. He looked at the telemetry. He looked at the calculation again. "Danny." He said it into the radio when Danny came around to the starting straight. "Yeah." "The last 3 laps." "What about them?" "Come in." Danny came in. Nathan showed him the numbers. Not just the lap times, which were already striking, but the efficiency data running underneath them, the engine's thermal signature through 12 laps of sustained performance. The power output maintaining its curve without the degradation that high-performance engines typically showed under that kind of extended load. Danny looked at the numbers for a long time. He had the helmet off and his hair was damp, and he looked like a man who had been concentrating very hard and was now processing an unexpected result. That's what it does at this track, Danny said, not a race environment. The track surface is different, the corner profile is different, but the engine behavior would translate. Would translate, Nathan said. Yes. Danny set the papers down carefully. How does Holcroft's power unit look in sustained performance? Nathan knew. He'd done the research months ago. It spikes higher but starts losing efficiency after 8 or 9 laps of sustained pressure. And we stay flat. Danny stood there for a moment with his hands on the roof of the car, looking at the numbers. Something was happening on his face that was not quite excitement. Danny wasn't built for excitement as an outward expression, but was something real underneath the reserve, some private reckoning. Caldwell is 12 laps per stage, Danny said. Yes. At sustained race pace. Yes. Danny looked at him. You built something, he said. It came out simple, without particular emphasis, which was why it hit the way it did. Nathan looked at the data. Yeah, he said. I think I did. They drove back to Marcus's garage without talking much, which was fine. Some things didn't need words wrapped around them to be understood. September moved fast in the way that time moves when you're running out of it. The Caldwell Regional 4 stage was scheduled for the second weekend of October, which meant 6 weeks of preparation that needed to cover mechanical finishing, regulatory compliance, logistics, and all the administrative scaffolding that surrounds motorsports competition, even at the regional level. Entry fees, technical inspection documentation, insurance, the particular taxonomy of forms that exist to ensure that people doing dangerous things have at least acknowledged the specific dangers in writing. The entry fee alone was a number that Nathan paid with the last of a savings account he'd opened when Lily was born, with the original intention of it being a college fund. He did it without letting himself think about it too long, because thinking about it too long led to a calculation he couldn't afford to make right now. It would either be paid back many times over or it wouldn't, and the only variable he could control was whether the car was ready. They had no sponsors. He'd made 12 calls in August, been passed off to an assistant or a marketing department in 8 of them, had 3 actual conversations that went nowhere, and one that went somewhere briefly before the contact came back and said the company's motorsports budget was committed for the year. He had a friend at a local auto parts shop who offered to put their logo on the car for a contribution that was less than the cost of the vinyl lettering, and he took it because it was something. The car would run with the shop's logo and Nathan's last name on the door. That was it. Marcus found this funnier than Nathan did. Classic, he said, looking at the finished car on the Friday before they were set to trailer it to Caldwell. Nathan Brooks, sponsored by Dave's Auto Supply. Precision Parts, Nathan said. It's called Precision Parts. I know what it's called. I've driven past it 100 times. It's still funny. Danny, who was walking around the car doing a final visual inspection with the particular focus of a driver who sleeps better knowing he's checked things himself, looked over. I've raced for worse backing. That's not reassuring, Nathan said. Wasn't meant to be. They loaded the car onto a borrowed trailer at 5 a.m. on Saturday morning, the October air carrying the first real chill of the season. Lily was there, bundled in a jacket, awake earlier than anyone had intended because she'd heard the garage door and gotten up to investigate. She stood in the driveway drinking the hot chocolate Mrs. Carver had made her, watching the loading process with the serious attention she gave to things she understood mattered to her father. Is that the car you built? She asked Nathan when the loading was nearly done. The engine, he said. Marcus helped with the rest. She looked at it for a long moment. The car wrapped in transport covers, loaded on the trailer, the logo of a local auto parts shop on the door. Is it going to win? Nathan crouched down to her level. She was 7 now, had been 7 since June, and somewhere in the past year she'd started asking questions that deserved better than simplified answers. I don't know, he said, but it's the best I know how to build. She thought about that. Is the best you know how to build good enough? I think so. I really think so. She nodded. Okay. She held out her hot chocolate. You want some? He took a sip. It was too sweet the way she liked it. Yeah, he said. Thanks. She took it back. Drive safe, she said very seriously, as if she were the adult in this scenario and he needed reminding. Marcus, overhearing from the back of the trailer, made the cough sound again. Caldwell Raceway was a mid-sized regional facility. Not glamorous, not a television venue, but the real infrastructure of motorsports. Proper pit lane, timing equipment, technical inspection bay, grandstands that held a few thousand people when full, which on a regional racing weekend they usually weren't. The paddock had the organized chaos that Nathan associated with race weekends. Teams setting up, crew members moving equipment with the purposeful urgency of people who have done this before and know exactly how much time they don't have. Holcroft Motorsports had a setup that announced itself without trying to. 2 matching transporters, a full crew and matching team gear, hospitality tent, timing equipment that was almost certainly more sophisticated than Caldwell's own. Their cars were prepared to the kind of finish that came from proper budgets and professional fabricators, clean, aggressive, the aesthetic of money competently applied. Nathan pulled the trailer into their assigned paddock space, which was on the far end of the lane, and the 3 of them, Nathan, Danny, Marcus, stood for a moment looking at what they'd driven past on the way in. Don't look at their stuff, Danny said. I'm not comparing. You are. Stop. Danny turned toward their trailer and started unloading equipment. Our car runs what it runs. Their car runs what it runs. The results tell us what we need to know, and looking at their budget doesn't change anything. Marcus picked up a toolbox. He's right. I wasn't going to say anything, Nathan said. You had a face, Marcus said. What face? The one you make when you're doing math that isn't going well for you. Marcus started toward their pit space. Come on, we've got a car to set up. Technical inspection passed without significant issues. There were 3 items the officials wanted reviewed, all of which were resolved within an hour, which Nathan took as confirmation that the car's build, whatever else you could say about it, was fundamentally sound. The inspector spent an extra few minutes looking at the engine, not with suspicion exactly, but with the focused attention of someone who hadn't seen this configuration before. Custom unit? The inspector asked. Yes? Homologation paperwork's in order. He looked at it a moment longer. Interesting architecture. Thank you, Nathan said. The inspector moved on. Nathan breathed. The 4-stage format at Caldwell worked on aggregate time. 4 separate races over the 2-day event, each 12 laps around the 2.4-kilometer circuit, combined time, determining the overall winner. Day 1 was 2 stages. Day 2 was 2 stages. You could have a bad first stage and recover if the car and driver held together across the distance. You could also lead comfortably through 3 stages and lose on the last one if something failed. It was a format that rewarded consistency as much as peak speed, which was a format that, if Nathan's efficiency numbers were right, was exactly the format they should want. He told Danny this on Friday evening, sitting in their modest team setup. 2 folding tables, a laptop, the data equipment Nathan had brought in a case he'd bought secondhand online. I know what the format rewards, Danny said. He was eating a sandwich, looking at the track map Nathan had printed. I've raced here before. I know, 3 years ago, 4. And I finished second in stage 3 and DNF'd stage 4 when the gearbox let go. He said it without particular emotion, the way you report facts about things that happen to a slightly different version of yourself. Different team, different car. Point is, I know the circuit. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't try to be fastest in stage 1. We should run the engine in its efficiency window. Nathan, Danny put the sandwich down. I know. You want me to run the middle RPM range for the first 8 laps of each stage and build through the final 4. I know. We've talked about this. He met Nathan's eyes. I have to trust you on the engine. You have to trust me on the race. Nathan closed the laptop. Fair. One more thing. Danny picked up the sandwich again. Holcroft's number 7 car. That's their pace car. Dawes is driving it. He's aggressive on the opening lap and he'll try to box out anything he doesn't recognize. Don't ask me to back off from him. I'm not going to ask you to back off from anyone. Engineers sometimes ask drivers to back off from situations that look dangerous from the pit wall but are actually fine from inside the car. I'll try not to do that. Good. Danny finished the sandwich. Get some sleep. You look terrible. I've been awake since 4. Sleep. Nathan slept after a fashion. He woke up twice and lay in the dark of the cheap motel room staring at the ceiling, running numbers that he'd already run. This was the thing about the gap between calculation and proof. Even when you were as certain as he was, there was a space that certainty couldn't fully occupy. The space that only ran on real evidence from the real world. Morning came gray and cool, a high overcast that diffused the light without threatening rain. The paddock was alive by 7, and by 8 the grandstands had a modest early crowd. The people who showed up before it got crowded because they genuinely loved the thing, not the ones who came for the atmosphere. Nathan had one person he'd told about the race. He'd called Diane Okafor on Tuesday and told her the date and the location and that the engine she'd helped save was going to run at Caldwell Regional on Saturday. He hadn't asked her to come. She was still at Meridian, and the dynamics of that were what they were. He'd just told her. She'd been quiet for a moment and then said she'd try to watch the timing feed online if she could find one. He hadn't called anyone else. He hadn't told Sandra. She had Lily for the weekend, which he was grateful for, because if Lily were here, she would have wanted to be in the pit lane, and the officials would not have allowed that, and the negotiation alone would have consumed an hour. He hadn't publicized it. The only people who knew Nathan Brooks was at Caldwell with an engine nobody had heard of were the 3 of them and Diane and the 7-year-old who had told him to drive safe. Stage 1 went off at 10 a.m. Danny qualified the car 7th out of 14, which Nathan thought was exactly right. Visible, but not the kind of prominent that invites aggressive attention. Holcroft's 2 cars qualified 1st and 3rd. The field was the mix that regional racing always was. 2 or 3 genuinely fast professional-grade setups, several competent semi-professional operations, and a handful of enthusiast-level teams whose drivers were good, but whose cars were not really in the same conversation. Nathan stood at the pit wall with a radio and his data laptop and watched the starting grid assemble. He had built the thing in the notebooks. He had built the thing in Marcus's garage. He had run it 47 times on a bench, and 6 times on a test track, and 2 times in an empty parking lot, and once in a careful installation check. He had looked at these numbers from every angle available to him, and they were right. He was as certain as it was possible to be certain about anything you hadn't yet proved to the world. He was also, standing at that pit wall, genuinely, acutely afraid. Not the kind of fear that makes you want to run. The kind that means the thing in front of you is real. The lights went to red, then green. The field accelerated off the line with the particular sound of 15 engines at full throttle that Nathan had heard at races before but had always been watching from a distance, as a spectator. From the pit wall it was different, closer, bigger, the sound pressing against you rather than arriving from across the circuit. He tracked their car. Number 31, white with blue lettering, Dave's Precision Parts on the door. Through the first turn cluster, watch Danny hold his line through the inevitable first lap positioning scramble, come out of turn 2 in 6th. Good. Exactly where Danny had said he wanted to be. For the first 7 laps, Nathan watched and took data and said almost nothing on the radio. Danny was running the engine in the middle range the way they'd discussed, managing fuel, staying out of incidents, letting the race settle into its rhythm. Holcroft's cars were running 1-2 at the front, a comfortable half-second between them and the third-place car. The field was stratifying the way racing fields always did, the fast cars pulling forward, the mid-pack settling, the backmarkers beginning to get lapped in their future. On lap 8, Nathan looked at his data. The engine was exactly where it was supposed to be. Every metric consistent with Stage 3 bench testing, consistent with the test track sessions, running clean and even, and with none of the thermal degradation signature that he'd been watching for and had now confirmed wasn't coming. The efficiency curve was holding. While Holcroft's cars had been pushing hard since lap 1, their data, which Nathan couldn't see directly but could model from publicly available information about their power unit, suggested they would start giving back performance around lap 9 or 10. "Danny," he said into the radio. "Yeah." "Lap 8. You're free." A 2-second pause. "Copy that." On lap 8, car 31 began to move. Not dramatically, not in the way of television racing where a car suddenly charges through the field in a single spectacular sequence. It moved the way Nathan had intended the engine to move, incrementally, consistently, the power output building through its range without the spike and manage cycle that the other cars were working through. Danny picked off fifth on the back straight of lap 8, clean and committed. No wheel-to-wheel drama. Fourth on lap 9, through a corner sequence where the exit acceleration differential became visible for the first time in the race. Nathan was writing data and watching and not saying anything because there was nothing to say. Danny was driving the car, and the car was doing what it was built to do, and the only thing Nathan could contribute right now was not getting in the way of either of those facts. Third on lap 10. On lap 11, Holcroft's second car, the one in first position, made a move to block that suggested its driver was aware of the white car behind him and was not interested in giving ground. Danny didn't take the bait. He stayed patient through lap 11, managing the gap, running his own race rather than reacting to the one in front of him. Nathan had half expected to need to talk him through that moment. He didn't. Lap 12. The last lap. Holcroft's lead car hit the long back straight first, with car 31 half a second behind. This was the engine's ground. Extended high speed, the place where sustained power output and efficiency mattered more than anything else. Nathan watched the telemetry and saw the gap closing. He didn't say anything. He watched. Coming out of the final complex of corners, 300 meters from the finish line, car 31 was alongside Holcroft's car, side by side down the run to the line. Nathan was aware that he was gripping the edge of the pit wall with both hands and had been for an indeterminate amount of time. The finish. Car 31 crossed ahead by the timing system said 0.04 of a second, which was not a comfortable margin, which was also a win. Stage 1. Out of 14 cars, car 31 finished first. Nathan stood at the pit wall and stared at the timing screen. Marcus appeared from somewhere to his left. Did we just... Yes, Nathan said. Stage 1. Yes. Marcus put a hand on Nathan's shoulder briefly, the kind of gesture that said everything the moment didn't have time for, and then pulled it back and looked at the timing screen himself. Holcroft's going to adjust, he said. Yes, Nathan said. I know. Well, their engineers are going to figure out pretty quickly that whatever just passed them is doing something different. I know. Are we going to be okay when they adjust? Nathan looked at the numbers on his screen, at the engine's thermal data across 12 laps of race conditions, the consistency of the output curve, the absence of the performance degradation he'd been modeling against, at the gap between what his engine was doing and what would need to happen for the adjustments Holcroft could realistically make to close it. Yeah, he said. We're going to be okay. Danny came over the radio. Tell me the margin. 0.04. A pause. I left time on the table in lap 11. You won stage 1. I left time on the table, Danny said again. Not self-critical exactly, just precise. I'll be cleaner in stage 2. Nathan looked at Marcus. He's going to be cleaner in stage 2, he said. Marcus shook his head slowly. 3 more stages, he said. Let's not celebrate yet. They didn't celebrate. They went back to the tables and pulled the data and went through it lap by lap, looking for everything the race had told them that the test track hadn't, every calibration available in the gap between controlled and real. Nathan made 3 adjustments between stage 1 and stage 2, small, targeted, the kind of refinements that only became visible under race conditions. Danny walked the circuit alone during the break, which was something he apparently always did between stages and which Nathan had learned not to interrupt. Stage 2 went green at 2 p.m. The field had rearranged itself in the way that competition always rearranges. Holcroft's cars now starting more aggressively positioned, their crew visible in animated conversation in the pit lane before the start in a way that suggested the first stage result had not gone unnoticed. Nathan watched the start and said into the radio, "They know." "I know they know," Danny said. "It's fine." For the first 4 laps of stage 2, Holcroft's number 7 car, Dawes driving, the aggressive one Danny had mentioned, ran a specific kind of race designed to complicate car 31's lines. Not illegal, or not clearly illegal, but tactical in the way that experienced professional teams are tactical when they've identified a threat they didn't see coming and are deciding how seriously to take it. Danny was patient in a way that Nathan found difficult to be from the pit wall, watching a faster car be slowed by someone else's racecraft. He said nothing on the radio. Danny had told him to trust the race, and he was trying. On lap 5, Danny said, "I'm going around him on the outside of 7. Outside of 7 was the long right-hander that Nathan's track map had flagged as a difficult overtaking point. I know, I've got the speed. Danny, trust the car, Danny said. You built it for exactly this. Nathan closed his mouth. On lap 5, turn 7, car 31, went to the outside of Dawes's car on the long right-hander and held the line through the corner with the kind of sustained exit acceleration that the engine's efficiency curve made possible. Not a spike, not a gamble on a moment of power, but a held building push through the full arc of the corner that Dawes's car couldn't match because his power unit was already giving back what it had spent. It was not a close move. By the time they were through the corner, there was clear air between them, and by the end of the straight there was a gap. Nathan looked at the data. "Clean," he said into the radio. "Told you," Danny said. Stage 2, car 31, first place. Margin over second, 3.5 seconds. By the time they were packing up for the day, other teams were looking at them. Not with hostility, exactly. Regional racing didn't have the corporate edge of the top-level stuff, but with the particular attention that gets directed at the unknown quantity that has just announced itself in unavoidable terms. Someone came over from a midfield team to ask about the engine in the straightforward way that racing people sometimes approach things they were curious about, and Nathan answered politely and briefly and did not provide details. That evening in the motel, Nathan sat on the bed with his laptop and the day's data spread around him and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, which would have been premature, but a specific quietness, the kind that comes from a long period of uncertainty resolving into evidence. The numbers had said the thing would work. Now the thing was working. The distance between those 2 points had been almost 3 years of his life. He called Lily before bed. Sandra answered and handed the phone over with the minimal exchange of parents sharing custody logistics. "Hi, Daddy." Lily's voice was sleepy. "How was the race?" "Good," he said. "We're in the lead." "I knew it," said with complete, uncomplicated certainty, as if this had never been in question. "What's for breakfast tomorrow?" He almost laughed. "I don't know yet. Get something good." A pause. "I made you another drawing. The car. I'll put it on the garage wall when I get home." "Okay." Another pause, longer. "I'm going to sleep now." "Okay, sweetheart." "Do good tomorrow," she said. "I'll try." He sat in the quiet motel room for a while after he hung up. Then he turned off the light and lay in the dark and didn't try to run any numbers at all. 2 stages down. 2 to go. Victoria Hayes did not plan to be at Caldwell Raceway that Sunday. She had planned to be in her office, which was where she spent most Sundays, working through the stack of financial modeling and contract documentation that never fully cleared no matter how many hours she put into it. Meridian's restructuring was 18 months in and showing real results, costs stabilized, 3 new contracts signed with mid-tier regional teams, the bleeding stopped, if not yet reversed, into something that could be called growth. She had done what she'd been brought in to do, and she was doing it methodically. And on most Sundays, the office was quiet and the thinking was clear, and that was what she preferred. The call that changed her Sunday came from a man named Grant Holloway, who was the technical director at one of Meridian's newer contract clients, and who had been at Caldwell on Saturday for reasons related to scouting competitive field conditions for his own team's upcoming season. He called her at 8:45 on Sunday morning while she was on her second coffee. "Have you looked at the Caldwell timing results from yesterday?" he asked, without preamble. "No? Why would I?" "There's an independent car running there. No team affiliation anyone recognizes. No sponsor, to speak of. They won both stages yesterday." A pause. "By margins that are hard to explain with the equipment they appear to be running." Victoria set down her coffee. "Appears to be running. Their declared engine specs are homologated. I checked. Custom unit listed as a proprietary design. Nobody in the paddock knows who built it." Another pause. But the performance data from the timing system, the split times through the back sector, the sustained pace on the final 2 laps of each stage, it doesn't look like anything from a standard power unit configuration. It looks like something running an unusually efficient thermal management cycle. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Thermal management. The phrase landed with a specific gravity. "What's the team name?" she said. "That's the thing. It's listed as Brooks Independent Racing." He said it casually, the way you relay information you haven't yet filtered for significance. Car 31. Driver is a guy named Reyes, regional circuit. Nothing special on paper. Victoria set the coffee cup down very carefully on the desk. Brooks. "Send me the timing data," she said. "Already did. Check your email." She was already opening it. The data was public record. Regional Racing published timing information for transparency, and what it showed was consistent with what Holloway had described, and considerably more striking when she looked at it with engineering eyes. The split times through Sector 3, which was the high-speed extended section of Caldwell's circuit, told a specific story. Car 31 was not fastest through Sector 1, where raw acceleration off the start determined position. It was not fastest through Sector 2, the technical midsection. But through Sector 3, on every single lap of both stages, it produced numbers that were not just competitive with Holcroft's factory-prepared cars, but exceeded them. Not by a dramatic margin, but by a consistent one that didn't diminish over lap distance the way every other car in the field did. She looked at that consistency for a long time. She had spent 3 years in technical consulting at a Formula One adjacent operation before Vantage Capital. She understood power units. She understood the particular fingerprint that different engine architectures left in timing data. What she was looking at had a fingerprint she recognized, not from any specific car she'd worked with, but from a concept she'd read about in an engineer's notebooks, sitting in her office at Meridian 18 months ago. During a Friday afternoon meeting, she had ended by signing a termination letter. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She looked at the data one more time. Then she got in her car and drove to Caldwell Raceway. She told herself on the drive that she was going for professional reasons, competitive intelligence. If there was genuinely novel engine technology operating in her market segment, understanding it was part of her job. This was a reasonable position, and she held it for most of the 90-minute drive, and she almost believed it. She arrived at Caldwell at 10:40, parked in the public lot, walked through the public entrance because she had no paddock credential and hadn't thought to arrange one. The grandstands were modest, maybe 1,000 people for the Sunday sessions, the kind of crowd that regional racing drew, knowledgeable and quiet compared to the big venues. She found a position near the pit lane fence where the view of the paddock was reasonable and pulled out her phone to cross-reference the paddock layout with the car number. Car 31. White with blue lettering, far end of the paddock lane. She found it from the fence line before Stage 3 went to grid. It was exactly as described. A spare minimal operation, no transporter, just a trailer, 2 folding tables, basic equipment, 3 people. One of them she didn't recognize, stocky, moving around the car with the confident efficiency of someone mechanical. The driver she could identify from the helmet in his hand. And the third one, standing at the tables, looking at a laptop, his back partially toward her. Even from this distance, across a paddock, she knew the posture. She had hired Nathan Brooks. She had managed him for 4 months. She had sat across a conference table from him and watched him try to make the case for something he believed in absolutely. And she had watched the careful way he held himself when the answer wasn't going his way, the specific controlled stillness of a person who has learned not to show too much. She knew that posture. She stood at the fence and looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the car, the white car with the modest logo and the engine she had called a fantasy, and the timing data that was sitting in her email telling her something she did not yet know how to feel about. Stage 3 went to grid at 11 a.m. She found a spot in the grandstands where she could see both the pit lane and the main straight. She had never been particularly interested in watching racing for its own sake. She followed it professionally, attended events when her work required it, but she was not a fan in the emotional sense of the word. She watched races the way she read financial statements, for information, with discipline, not with attachment. Stage 3 changed that, at least temporarily. She watched car 31 qualify third on the grid and thought, conservative. She watched the start and saw it hold position through the first lap chaos and thought, patient. She watched laps 2 through 7 and tracked its movement through the field with the timing data on her phone, cross-referencing what she saw with the numbers and understood with increasing clarity what she was watching. The engine was doing what Nathan had said it would do. The efficiency curve was real. The sustained performance through the final laps was real. It was not a fluke of the first day. It was a system behaving consistently the way its designer had intended, in race conditions, against professional competition, and it was working. On lap 9, car 31 moved to second position. On lap 10, it was behind Holcroft's lead car. On lap 11, it passed it. Victoria sat in the grandstand and watched car 31 pull away in the final laps of stage 3, with the particular sensation of someone watching a proof they had previously rejected being demonstrated in front of them. It was not comfortable. She was not the kind of person who experienced discomfort without acknowledging it to herself, even when acknowledging it was unpleasant. She had been wrong, not about the financial logic. The financial logic of her decision had been sound given the information she had and the mandate she was operating under. But she had said the words, "I believe you believe that," and she had meant them as a careful distinction between Nathan's conviction and what she was willing to credit as objective reality, and the timing data said, without ambiguity, that Nathan's conviction had been warranted. Stage 3, car 31, first place. Aggregate lead over the field heading into Stage 4 was now substantial. She went down to the fence again during the break between stages. She was not sure what she intended. She told herself she was going to observe. She told herself she was going to make a professional assessment of what she was seeing and take it back to her work at Meridian and figure out what, if anything, it meant for the company's competitive positioning. She watched the far end of the paddock through the fence. She could see Nathan at the tables, going through data with the driver. Reyes, who had the specific contained energy of someone at the end of a sustained effort who was not letting himself feel it yet. She could see Marcus working on something at the rear of the car. She could see the three of them talking, and she was too far away to hear any of it, but she could read the body language of people working well under pressure. And what she saw was a unit that trusted each other. She had fired the man who built that engine, and he had gone to a friend's garage and built it anyway. She thought about that for a while. Stage 4 went green at 2 p.m. The field by this point had a different quality than it had on Saturday. The other teams understood what car 31 was, or at least understood what it was doing, and the racing around it had the quality of competition that is clarified into direct conflict. Holcroft's 2 cars ran a more coordinated strategy in Stage 4, clearly having had a team conversation during the overnight break about how to manage car 31's pace. It was not unsporting, exactly. It was the kind of professional response that well-funded teams made when confronted with something unexpected. But it was pressure, and it was visible. Lap 1, lap 2. Car 31 running fourth, surrounded, the Holcroft cars ahead and behind in a formation that was making clean air hard to find. Victoria found herself watching with both hands on the fence rail, which she noticed and found mildly embarrassing and did not stop doing. On lap 3, there was contact. Not severe, not the kind that brings out flags. But Holcroft's trailing car made a move into a braking zone that was more optimistic than it had any right to be, and the result was a tap on car 31's rear quarter that sent it briefly wide, losing the line through the corner, dropping to 6th as 2 cars came through on the outside. Her breath stopped for half a second. Car 31 held it. Danny Reyes, whoever this person was, this driver she'd never heard of, controlled the slide with the precise, unhurried correctness of someone who had been in worse situations and knew how to be calm inside chaos. He lost positions, but he didn't lose the car, and he didn't lose the engine, which was what mattered most in an aggregate competition. On the radio, she couldn't hear the radio, obviously, but she could see Nathan at the pit wall, and she could see the way he stood when car 31 came out of the incident upright. She thought, he's talking to the driver. She thought, he's keeping his voice steady. She thought, he knows how to do this. She thought, why do you know that about him, and you still made the call you made? She knew the answer. It was the same answer it had always been. The financial reality of Meridian in January of last year had not been invented. The margin had been real. The risk had been real. She had made the decision she was paid to make with the information available to her, and she would make it again in the same circumstances. And it was also true that she had been looking at a man with something extraordinary in his notebooks and called it an expensive distraction. Both of those things were simultaneously true, which was the hardest kind of thing to hold. Car 31 worked its way back through the field, 6th to 5th on lap 5, through corner patience rather than straight-line aggression, 5th to 4th on lap 7, when the car ahead made a mistake and Danny didn't miss the window, 4th to 3rd on lap 9, through the back sector where the engine's sustained output told its story again with the same quiet insistence it had been telling it all weekend, 3rd to 2nd on lap 10, one car ahead, Holcroft's number 7, Dawes, who had been in the lead since lap 2 and had been running a controlled, disciplined race, the kind that a professional with a fast car runs when he's trying to win on competence rather than risk. Laps 11 and 12. Victoria watched them run the final 2 laps of the stage, of the event, of everything Nathan Brooks had spent almost 3 years building toward. She watched car 31 close the gap through the back sector of lap 11, running out of room before the finish line. She watched lap 12 begin with Dawes aware of the car behind him and driving accordingly. Not dirty, but committed, the way professionals drive when they mean to win. Into the final corner sequence. 2 cars, the gap 0.3 of a second, the run to the line. Through the final corner, car 31 took the inside, not with the desperate lunge of a car that was faster in that one moment only, but with the building assurance of a car that had been incrementally faster for 24 laps across 2 days and was finally, in the last 800 meters of the event, demonstrating the full extent of what that difference meant. The line. She didn't have the timing on her phone. She had to wait for the grandstand screen to update. Car 31. Stage 4, first. Event aggregate, first. She stood at the fence with her hands on the rail. Across the paddock, she could see Marcus's arms go up. She could see Danny Reyes climb out of the car and stand beside it with his hands on his knees for a moment, breathing. She could see Nathan standing at the pit wall tables with his back to the paddock and his hands flat on the table, looking at his laptop, and from this distance and this angle she could not see his face. She went to the paddock gate and asked an official if she could get access to speak with someone in car 31's team. The official looked at her clearly professional attire, and checked her ID, and after a brief radio conversation, said yes. She walked the paddock lane toward the far end. Nathan was aware of the win the way you're aware of something enormous that hasn't fully become real yet. Present, substantial, occupying the space where certainty used to be impossible. The data on his laptop confirmed it 6 times over because he kept pulling it up and looking at it, not from doubt, but from some need to have the confirmation be repeatable, to know that looking away and looking back wouldn't change what the screen said. Danny had come over and they'd shaken hands, which, given the nature of what they'd built together over 4 months, felt somewhat insufficient, but Danny was not a man who did theatrical moments, and Nathan respected that. Marcus had hugged him, briefly and firmly, the hug of a 22-year friendship, understanding this was one of the moments it had been carrying the weight of. 17%, Marcus said, into his shoulder. We haven't signed anything yet, Nathan said, but when we do, 17. We'll argue about it after. You said we'd argue after, and I'm noting the after has arrived. Nathan pulled back and looked at him. Let me have 10 minutes before the negotiating starts. Marcus held up his hands. 10 minutes. Danny had gone to cool down and do the post-stage requirements. Signing, the brief ceremony, the handshakes with the other top finishers that were part of the format. The paddock around them had the specific energy of an event that had produced an unexpected result. People moving with slightly more purpose than usual, conversations happening in clusters, the particular alertness of a community that had seen something it didn't have a framework for yet. Nathan was looking at the efficiency data from Stage 4, the full picture of the engine's thermal management across the entire event, 48 laps of race conditions, the curve holding from first lap to last with the consistency he'd modeled and argued for and been told was a fantasy. When he heard someone stop behind him, he turned around. Victoria Hayes looked in the afternoon light of a paddock she hadn't planned to be in, like someone who had made a decision to be somewhere and was now experiencing the full weight of having arrived. She was wearing the clothes of someone who'd driven somewhere without changing first, not her usual professional standard. Her expression was controlled in the way her expressions always were, which meant the thing underneath was something she was choosing not to show yet. Nathan looked at her for a moment. He had imagined this in a distant way, the way you sometimes imagine future conversations with people who have defined a difficult chapter. He had not imagined it happening here, in the paddock, 4 hours after the race. He had no prepared version of this encounter. Victoria, he said. Just her name. Neutral. Nathan. She looked at the laptop, at the car, at the minimal operation of 2 tables and borrowed equipment that had just won a 4-stage regional event. I drove up this morning. I saw the Saturday timing data and She stopped. Restarted. I wanted to see it myself. Okay. Both stages today. I watched from the grandstand. She paused. And from the fence. He didn't say anything. He was giving her the space to get to whatever she'd come here to say, because Victoria Hayes was not a person who drove 90 minutes and walked into a paddock without something she needed to say. I owe you an acknowledgement, she said. The word was careful, precise, not apology exactly, but something adjacent to it that she'd clearly chosen with intention. What you built, she looked at the car again. It's not a fantasy. No, he said, it's not. The efficiency curve, the thermal management through extended race pace. It's doing exactly what you described in my office. A pause. 14 months ago. 18, he said. Not harshly, just accurately. 18, she acknowledged. She held that for a moment. My decision was based on... I know what it was based on, he said. I understood it at the time. Meridian's position was real. The financial logic was sound. He looked at her. You were wrong about the engine. You weren't entirely wrong about the situation. She seemed to have expected something else. Defensiveness, or the kind of carefully managed anger that he'd have been entitled to and that she'd probably have been prepared for. The directness of what he actually said appeared to require a brief recalibration. That's... She paused. More generous than I'd expected. I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. He turned back to the laptop, looked at the data for a moment, then looked at her again. What are you here for, Victoria? Actually here for? She met his eyes. Meridian's currently negotiating its engine supply contracts for next year. I have 2 mid-tier teams who are interested in performance-class power units, and I have nothing compelling to offer them. She said it the way she said things that were difficult, plainly, without the softening that required more from her than she was willing to spend on sentiment. I want to know if you'd be willing to have a conversation. Nathan looked at her. Behind him, he could hear Marcus moving equipment, carefully not appearing to listen, which meant he was absolutely listening. A conversation, Nathan said. About licensing or supply arrangements, or whatever structure makes sense. She paused. I'm not here to recover what I dismissed. I'm here because it's now demonstrably real, and I run a company that has relationships and infrastructure and existing client trust that could help bring it to a wider market. Another pause. And because I owe you the ask in person. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the February morning he'd driven to Marcus's garage with 3 notebooks and a thermos of 2 strong coffee. He thought about riding a bicycle in the rain and selling the truck, and calling his ex-wife for a scheduling favor, and 11 days circling a materials problem that didn't want to be solved. He thought about Diane Okafor sending encrypted data from a job she could have lost for sending it. He thought about Lily, in her pajamas, taking the notebooks off his knees. He thought about 18 months ago, in an office with Gerald's furniture still in it, and the words, I believe you believe that. I'll have the conversation, he said, but I'm not having it today. Of course. And not with just the 2 of us. My attorney needs to be present, and Marcus Webb, who has been a significant part of making this possible. Understood. And whatever arrangement we discuss is going to need to account fairly for everyone who took a risk on this when nobody else would. He said it without heat, but with complete clarity. That's not negotiable from the start. Also understood. She paused. Who's your attorney? I'll have one by the time we sit down. He didn't yet. That was fine. Something moved across Victoria's face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has just been reminded of a quality they had underestimated. Fair, she said. Danny Reyes appeared at the edge of their conversation, having returned from the post-stage formalities, and stopped when he saw Victoria. He looked at Nathan with a brief question in his expression. Danny Reyes, meet Victoria Hayes, Nathan said. She's the CEO of Meridian Motorsports. Danny looked at her for a moment. The one who fired you. Yes, Victoria said before Nathan could say anything. She said it without flinching. Danny considered her with the flat evaluating look he used on timing data. You come to offer him something, or to apologize? Both, potentially, Victoria said. Danny looked at Nathan. You going to hear her out? We're going to schedule a meeting, Nathan said, after I've had some time to... He gestured at the general situation. The win, the paddock, the fact that his legs were tired and he hadn't eaten since 6 a.m., and the engine that had lived in his notebooks for 26 months had just won a race. Danny nodded once. Then he looked at Victoria with the particular directness of someone who has nothing to prove, and therefore no reason to be indirect. He built something real, Danny said. Whatever you offered him before, it wasn't enough to recognize that. Victoria held his gaze. I know. Make sure you know that when you're in the room, Danny said. He picked up his helmet bag from the table and walked away, which was Danny's version of having said everything that needed saying. Marcus materialized from wherever he'd been not listening. He looked at Victoria with a considerably less hostile but equally assessing expression. Marcus Webb, he said. I know, Victoria said. Your garage is where this happened. Most of it, Marcus said. He looked at Nathan. I'm going to load the car. You two finish up. He walked away toward the trailer with the deliberate tact of someone giving space on purpose. Nathan looked at Victoria. She looked at him. The paddock moved around them, other teams doing their post-event breakdown, the announcement system reading results, the ordinary machinery of a racing day concluding itself around the extraordinary specific fact of Car 31's aggregate time sitting at the top of the results board. The engine's going to attract attention beyond today, Victoria said. Regional racing results travel. Other teams' technical people will look at this data and start asking questions. I know. You're going to need more than a friend's garage and a borrowed trailer to manage what comes next. I know that too. He looked at her. I've known what this engine was for 3 years. I had time to think about the next steps. She nodded. She seemed to be deciding whether to say something else. Nathan. She said it with slightly more weight than she'd been carrying the name. I looked at your notebooks in January, before I made the call. I stayed an hour after that meeting and read through what you'd shared. She paused. I understood more of it than you'd have expected. He looked at her. That he hadn't known. And, he said, and I thought the core concept was genuinely interesting. More than I said. I was managing a situation where genuinely interesting wasn't a category that had value in that moment. She held his gaze. I want you to know the dismissal wasn't from ignorance. I understood what I was dismissing. He held that for a moment. He wasn't sure if it made it better or worse. He decided it made it something else entirely. Not better or worse, just more complete. More true. That's actually harder to hear, he said. I thought it might be, she said quietly. I said it anyway. He nodded. She handed him a business card. The Meridian card, with her direct line handwritten on the back. When you're ready, she said. He took it. He looked at it. The same name that had been on the termination letter, on a white card, in a paddock where the timing board still had Car 31 at the top. I'll be in touch, he said. She held his gaze for one more moment, and in it was something he hadn't seen in that office 18 months ago, or maybe something that had been there that he hadn't been looking for. Not regret exactly. The particular expression of someone who has reassessed a calculation and found the error and is now living in what the corrected version looks like. Then she turned and walked back down the paddock lane, and Nathan watched her go, and then looked at the car, and then at his laptop, and then at the results board where it still said what it said. Marcus appeared beside him. He had the look of someone who had heard considerably more of that conversation than he was going to admit to. "Well," Marcus said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You going to call her?" "Eventually." "Define eventually." "After I've slept, and eaten something, and called Lily." Nathan looked at the results board one more time. "And after I've found an attorney." "I know a guy," Marcus said. "Of course you do. He's good. Reasonable rates. He once got a contractor out of a materials dispute that—" "Marcus." "Yeah." "Can we just stand here for a minute?" Marcus stopped talking. He looked at the results board, too. They stood there in the paddock, the two of them, in the October afternoon light, while the racing day concluded around them and the board said what it said. After a while, Marcus said, 17%. Nathan didn't look away from the board. "We'll talk about it." "We're talking about it now." 16. 17. "Fine," Nathan said. 17. Marcus nodded. "Good." They stood there a little longer. The board still said car 31, first place, and the number didn't change no matter how many times Nathan looked at it, and eventually he stopped testing whether it would, and just let it be true. The attorney Marcus knew turned out to be exactly what Nathan needed, which was someone who understood both intellectual property law and the specific dynamics of technology licensing in competitive industries, and who charged rates that were high enough to signal competence, but not so high as to require Nathan to take the first deal offered just to cover the legal fees. Her name was Patricia Chun, and she had the focused, no-ceremony manner of someone who had spent 20 years watching people with good ideas get taken advantage of in negotiations they didn't understand, and had decided that preventing that was a worthwhile use of a career. She was in her late 50s, kept her office in a state of organized chaos that she navigated without hesitation, and had a habit of asking questions that felt obvious until you tried to answer them and realized they weren't. She met Nathan and Marcus at her office on a Thursday evening, 11 days after Caldwell. Nathan brought the relevant documentation, the engine design notebooks, the IP filings he'd initiated the week after the race through an online service he could barely afford, the Stage 3 and race testing data, and a timeline of development that established clearly what had been produced on his own time and resource versus what had any conceivable connection to his employment at Meridian. Patricia read through everything with the unhurried focus of someone who billed by the hour and therefore had no incentive to rush, and occasionally made notes in the margin of a yellow legal pad without explaining what she was writing. "Walk me through the Meridian situation," she said when she'd finished. Nathan did. He was concise about it. The timeline, the meeting with Victoria, the termination, the IP review that Meridian had conducted, and the outcome of which he'd received in a letter 2 months after his departure, stating that the project had been developed substantially outside company time and resource, and that Meridian was not asserting proprietary claim. He set that letter on the desk. Patricia read it. "They let it go." "Yes. That's notable. Either they genuinely reviewed the timeline and concluded you were clean, or they made a practical decision that pursuing it wasn't worth the cost and publicity of the fight." She set the letter down. "Either way, it works in your favor." "The timeline was genuine," Nathan said. "I was careful about it." Being careful and being able to prove you were careful are the same thing in a legal context. She looked at him. "Which you were, based on this." She tapped the documentation. "Now, tell me about Victoria Hayes' approach at Caldwell, exactly what she said." He told her. Patricia wrote on her legal pad, "And she's the one who initiated contact." "Yes." "She came to you, in your territory, after watching the results." "Yes." Patricia looked up. "Good. That's a meaningful negotiating position. You're not asking for anything. She is." She set the pen down. "Now, what do you actually want from this? Not what you think you can get. What do you want?" Nathan thought about it. He'd been thinking about it for 11 days, in the margins of everything else, while driving Lily to school, while running Stage 3 data for the 4th time, While lying awake at 2 a.m. the way he'd been doing for so long, it had started to feel like a personality trait. "I want the engine in competitive racing," he said, "properly resourced. Not a garage operation. Real development, real testing, real teams." He paused. "I want to stay involved in the technical development. I'm not interested in licensing the design and disappearing. Ongoing technical involvement. Yes, it's my design. The refinements are going to require me. Revenue structure. Royalties on licensing, not a one-time buyout. An equity in any dedicated entity formed around the engine." He paused. "And two specific provisions that aren't negotiable. Marcus Webb receives a formal stake in any commercial arrangement, defined before we sign anything. And Diane Okafor—" He stopped. He'd been thinking about how to handle Diane carefully. "There's someone who contributed critical technical data to the project at professional risk to herself. I want to find a way to recognize that structurally." Patricia looked at him. "You're going into a negotiation for a potentially significant commercial deal, and your first two non-negotiables are about other people." "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. "Okay, we can work with that." She picked up the pen again. "Now let me tell you what Meridian is going to want and where we push back." The first meeting with Victoria happened 12 days later in a conference room at a neutral location. Not Meridian's building, not Nathan's lawyer's office, but a business center Patricia had used before for exactly this kind of thing. The table was long, and the coffee was mediocre, and the light was the particular flat quality of conference room lighting everywhere, which Nathan had decided was specifically designed to prevent anyone from feeling too comfortable. Victoria came with Meridian's general counsel and a technical director Nathan didn't recognize. Nathan came with Patricia and Marcus, who sat with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had ridden a bicycle in the rain for months and was now sitting across from the woman who'd been a proximate cause of that and was prepared to listen before forming a definitive opinion. The first meeting was, as first meetings of this kind almost always are, a structured exchange of positions that left everyone more informed and nothing resolved. Victoria's opening position was reasonable, a licensing structure with Meridian as the exclusive regional distributor of Ember-equipped power units. Nathan retained as technical advisor at a defined rate, revenue sharing at a percentage that was fair but not generous. Patricia declined it politely and laid out a counter that was structured differently in ways that mattered. Ongoing royalties rather than a fixed licensing fee, technical involvement defined as co-development rather than advisory, equity stake rather than salary for the ongoing work, and the Marcus and Diane provisions stated plainly on page 2 of the document. Victoria's counsel read through it. Victoria read through it without expression. "The equity component," Victoria said. "You'd want equity in Meridian or in a separate entity." "Separate entity," Patricia said. "A dedicated commercial vehicle for the Ember engine development, with Meridian holding a majority stake, but Nathan and his partners holding meaningful minority positions." "Partners?" Victoria said. She looked at Marcus briefly. "Mr. Webb and—" She looked at the Diane provision. "This individual who contributed technical data." "Yes," Nathan said. "The data contribution was significant," Nathan said, "and she took a real professional risk to provide it. That matters to me." Victoria looked at him for a moment. He wasn't sure what she was reading in his face, but he wasn't trying to manage it. He'd decided before coming into this room that he was going to be exactly as direct as he always was, and let the result be whatever it was. "I'll need to understand the exposure on the data contribution," Victoria's counsel said. "If it involves proprietary Meridian testing data, it involves data from testing that established a flaw in a project Meridian had not formally claimed," Patricia said. "The IP review letter establishes clearly that Meridian did not assert rights over the Ember project. Testing data related to that project falls outside proprietary protection under those same terms." She slid a copy of the legal argument across the table. "We can litigate this question if necessary. I don't think anyone in this room wants to do that." Victoria read the argument. Her counsel leaned over and they exchanged a few quiet words. "No," Victoria said. "We don't want to litigate it." She looked at Nathan. "The provision for Ms. Okafor. What are you envisioning?" "A defined stake in the new entity. Small, but real. and a standing offer of involvement in the technical development if she wants it. He paused. She's good. She'll be useful. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, Meridian would need to manage the optics of a current employee holding equity in a separate entity built on a project she contributed to outside her employment scope. That's a Meridian internal problem, Patricia said, not our negotiating concern. I understand that, Victoria said, and she wasn't annoyed, just precise. I'm flagging it as a complexity we'd need to resolve before signing, not a reason to decline it. She looked at Nathan again. You're consistent, I'll give you that. I'm accurate, Nathan said. I told you the engine was real. I'm telling you these people are owed for what they put in. She held his gaze. Noted. The second meeting was 3 weeks later. The third was 2 weeks after that. Patricia called this pace efficient for a deal of this structure, which Nathan translated as, it could be worse. He spent the intervening weeks working, back at Marcus's garage, running refinements on the engine design that the Caldwell race conditions had surfaced, the ongoing work of a design that was proven but not finished because real engineering was never finished, just iterated toward better. He also spent those weeks living. Not in the dramatic, transformed way that a certain kind of story would require, where a victory clarifies everything, and the person on the other side of it becomes a version of themselves that the difficulty had been concealing. Life was not like that, and Nathan was a person who had spent enough time inside difficult stretches to know that what came after them was not transcendence but continuation, the ordinary material of days resuming at slightly different coordinates. He took Lily to a school event on a Wednesday evening and sat in the gymnasium watching her class's presentation about weather systems and felt something uncomplicated and warm that had nothing to do with engines or racing or negotiations. She spotted him from the stage and gave a small, restrained wave. She was 7, and waving at your parent from the stage was fine, but you couldn't make it seem like a big deal. And he waved back in the same register, and that small exchange was one of the better moments of the fall. He called Diane. He texted her the Caldwell results immediately after the race, and she'd responded with a single line. That's your number. I knew it. Which was the most Diane thing she could possibly have said. Now he called her to tell her about the negotiations, about the provision in the proposed entity structure with her name on it. She was quiet for longer than she usually was. Nathan, she said, it's a small stake, but it's real. And there's an offer of involvement if you want it. I could lose my job at Meridian over the data. I know, Patricia has structured the legal framing to limit that exposure, but I know it's not zero risk. Another silence. Does Victoria know it was me? Yes. And she's still agreeing to the provision. She's in the process of agreeing to it. She hasn't fought it the way her counsel initially flagged. Nathan paused. I think she understands that the data contribution was what made the race possible. And I think she's recalibrating some things. Diane made a sound that might have been a short laugh. That must be a strange experience for her. I think it is, he paused. Are you interested in the involvement? A long pause. Ask me again when the ink is dry, Diane said. But yes, probably yes. He hung up and sat in the kitchen for a while. The deal closed on a Tuesday morning in December, 8 weeks after the first meeting. The entity was named Ember Motor Technologies, with Meridian holding 51%, Nathan and Marcus holding 30% combined, split 17 and 13, which had taken 40 minutes of the final session to agree on, during which Patricia had watched both of them with the expression of someone who had handled more complicated negotiations and was genuinely bemused by the personal affection making this one harder. Diane holding 4%, and the remaining 15 distributed between 2 additional investors Patricia had brought in during the final structure phase to provide operating capital without requiring Nathan to cede additional control to Meridian. It was not the deal Nathan had drawn in his head in his best imagining of it. It was better in some ways, and compromised in others, which was what real deals were. And Patricia had told him going in to measure success by whether the core things he'd identified as non-negotiable survived intact, not by whether every number matched his ideal. The core things survived. Marcus signed his section of the documents with a pen he'd brought from the garage, which was the kind of detail that Nathan would remember for a long time. It was a perfectly ordinary pen. Marcus hadn't brought it on purpose. It was just the pen that was in his jacket pocket, which happened to be from the garage. Nathan noticed it and didn't say anything and thought that this was exactly right. Diane was patched in by phone for her signature section, having arranged a notary on her end. When her portion was complete, there was a brief moment where everyone in the conference room could hear her breathing on the line. "Congratulations," Patricia said, to the room generally. "Thank you," Victoria said. She was looking at Nathan when she said it, which seemed to be directed more specifically than the room at large. He looked back at her. "Thank you for coming to Caldwell," he said. She considered that. "I almost didn't." "I know. I'm glad you did." She nodded once. It wasn't warmth, exactly. Victoria Hayes was not a warm person by architecture, and he didn't need her to be. It was something more durable than warmth, the mutual recognition of two people who had been in an honest conflict and had arrived somewhere real on the other side of it. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. The first full development contract under Ember Motor Technologies was signed with a regional team called Hartfield Racing in February. The second followed 6 weeks later with a team that competed at a level above the regional circuit, which required performance documentation that Nathan and Diane, who had accepted the involvement offer and given her notice at Meridian in January on her own terms, spent 3 weeks producing with the particular satisfaction of people who have been waiting to do something properly and now have the resources to do it. The early months of Ember as an operating entity were not smooth. This deserves to be said plainly because the alternative, the version where success arrived and the difficulties resolved themselves in the warm aftermath of vindication, would be a different and less honest story. The manufacturing ramp-up had complications. A supplier relationship fell through in March and required a 6-week scramble to replace. There was a disagreement between Nathan and Meridian's technical director about the testing protocol for the Hartfield installation that went several rounds before Patricia helped structure a resolution that neither party loved and both could live with. Nathan and Victoria had 2 conversations that were genuinely difficult, not hostile, but honest in the way that business relationships can be when the underlying history has weight, and both people are too direct to pretend otherwise. In one of them, she told him that she thought he was being inflexible about the testing protocol out of protectiveness rather than technical necessity, and she was right, and he acknowledged it after a day of being annoyed about it. In the other, he told her that Meridian's marketing framing of the engine was presenting it in a way that understated the technical complexity to make it more commercially digestible, and he needed that to change because the teams buying it deserved to understand what they were getting. She changed it. They were never going to be friends. He understood that and made his peace with it, and found that the peace was genuine rather than just resigned. What they were was something more specific and more useful. 2 people who respected what the other brought to a shared table and had learned, through the specific education of conflict and renegotiation, how to work around the places where they didn't see the same thing. Diane proved to be exactly what Nathan had told Victoria she would be: good and useful, and in possession of the particular quality that made her indispensable to the development work: the ability to look at a problem from the data side and the practical engineering side simultaneously, to find the things the numbers were saying that intuition might miss. She and Nathan worked together with the specific friction of 2 people who challenged each other's assumptions and were both better for it. She kept her hair in the same practical style and her desk in the same scrupulous order and communicated in the same short, precise sentences, and Nathan found her presence in the work steadying in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Danny Reyes continued to race. He drove an Ember-equipped car in 3 regional events in the following season and won 2 of them, which was the kind of track record that started generating its own attention. He was not effusive about what the arrangement meant to him. He was Danny Reyes. He was not effusive about anything. But he called Nathan after the second win on a Sunday evening and said, "The engine's better than it was at Caldwell." "We've made some adjustments since October," Nathan said. "I can feel them." A pause. "You did good work." From Danny, who measured his words the way some people measured expensive ingredients, that was a significant statement. "You drove it," Nathan said. "Somebody had to." He could almost hear Danny's version of a smile, which expressed itself as a slight flattening of the voice rather than warmth. "I've got an inquiry from a team running at the national circuit level. They want to know about the engine." Nathan sat up. "What team?" Danny told him. It was not a top-tier team, but it was national circuit level, which was a different conversation than regional, and the fact that they were asking meant the Caldwell results had traveled further than the regional timing board. "Tell them to call Patricia," Nathan said. "Already sent them the contact," Danny said. "Just wanted you to know first." Nathan sat with the phone after he hung up, in the kitchen of the apartment that was still the same apartment, with the same layout and the same secondhand furniture, except that the second bedroom was now organized rather than chaotic, the notebooks stacked neatly rather than spread across every surface, because the thing they contained had stopped being a secret kept from the world and become a thing the world was starting to know about. Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table. She'd turned 8 in June and had developed strong opinions about the organizational inadequacy of her classroom's book storage system, which she had shared in detail with her teacher and subsequently with Nathan over dinner on multiple evenings. She was, as Marcus had predicted, going to run something someday, and the entity she ran was going to be highly organized and slightly surprised by how organized it was. She looked up from her worksheet. "Was that about the engine?" "Yes." "Good news or thinking face news?" "Good news." He put the phone down. "There's a team at the national level asking about it." She processed this. "Is that bigger than the race you won?" "It would be." "Yes." She nodded, returning to her worksheet with the same equanimity she applied to most of the engine news, which was the equanimity of a child who had watched her father work towards something for most of her conscious life and had developed a long view about it. "Cool," she said. "Cool," he agreed. He watched her work for a moment. The small frown of concentration she got, the way she erased something and wrote it again more carefully, the absolute seriousness she brought to the worksheet that was, he could see from across the table, about fractions. She had his chin and Sandra's eyes and some third quality that belonged entirely to herself, still forming, not yet fully visible. He thought about the man he'd been 26 months ago, sitting in a parking lot after the second bank visit, staring at a steering wheel. He thought about the bicycle in the rain and the fever notebooks and the 47th engine run. He thought about Marcus showing up with beer and Diane sending encrypted data and Danny rolling out from under a chassis and asking to see the Run 47 data. He thought about all the particular, unrepeatable things that had to happen exactly as they did for the engine to be what it was. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something more complicated than that and more durable. The specific satisfaction of a person who has tested something they believed in against the hardest available evidence and found out it was real. Not perfect. Real. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. His phone buzzed. "Marcus. National Circuit Team reaching out. Danny told me." "This is it." Nathan typed back. "Maybe. Patricia's handling the contact." Marcus. "Stop being careful. This is it." Nathan looked at the message. He looked at Lily doing her fractions. He looked at the kitchen, the stacked notebooks visible through the bedroom door, the apartment that had held all of this for 3 years. He typed, "Yeah, maybe it is." Then he put the phone down and said, "Hey, do you want some help with the fractions?" Lily looked up. "I don't need help." "I know you don't need help. Do you want some?" She considered this distinction, which she recognized as meaningful. "Okay," she said, "but don't do it for me." "I won't." He pulled a chair around to her side of the table and looked at the worksheet. She showed him where she was, and he asked a question that pointed her toward what she was missing without providing the answer, and she looked at him with mild irritation and then looked at the page and then wrote the answer herself. "See," she said, "I didn't need help." "Right," he said. She went back to the worksheet. He stayed at the table, in the kitchen light, in the apartment, in the ordinary Wednesday evening of it, and let himself be here rather than in the calculations. This was the thing nobody told you about the long projects, the ones that took years and cost more than money. The thing nobody told you was that arriving at the place you'd been working toward didn't feel like arrival, so much as it felt like the world catching up to what you'd already known was true. You'd lived inside the certainty of the thing for so long that the external validation, when it came, was real and important, and not quite the earthquake you'd expected. The earthquake was earlier. The earthquake was the February morning in Marcus's garage when the engine ran for the first time, and the numbers said what they said, and you sat on a stool with your face in your hands. That was when the world changed. Everything since then had been the world finding out. What came after winning was not the end of difficulty. He knew that. There would be more negotiations, more supplier problems, more conversations with Victoria that required honesty. He didn't always feel like producing. The National Circuit inquiry might go nowhere. It might go somewhere and bring complications he couldn't yet model. Ember Motor Technologies was 12 weeks old, and real companies had long arcs that didn't resolve cleanly. And he was not a person who had ever confused clarity of purpose with simplicity of path. But the engine was real, and the people who had stood beside it when it was nothing but notebooks were being recognized for what they'd given. And his daughter was doing her fractions at the kitchen table in the ordinary Wednesday light, and the notebooks were stacked neatly in the bedroom because they'd finished being a secret. That was enough. That was, counted honestly, a considerable amount. He sat at the table with Lily until the fractions were done, and then he made dinner. Something simple, pasta again, the same too simple thing he'd been feeding her for years when his mind was elsewhere. And she ate it without complaint because she had inherited his practicality about food along with his chin. They talked about the classroom book storage problem, which she had developed into a full proposal she was considering presenting formally to her teacher, and he listened with the genuine attention it deserved, which was more than it might have appeared to deserve from the outside. After she was in bed, he sat at his desk for a while with the notebooks. Not to work. There was always work, and it would be there tomorrow. He just sat with them. The locked fireproof box was still under the desk. He'd bought it 4 years ago for these specific notebooks and never found a better place for it. Most of the notebooks were out of the box now, stacked on the shelf, because secrecy had become irrelevant. But the first one was still in the box, out of habit or sentiment or some instinct about keeping things in the place where they'd originally lived. He took it out. He opened it to the first page, which had the date at the top. 2 days after Lily's 4th birthday, which was when the idea had arrived in its first coherent form, not as a plan but as a question. What if the heat recapture in the secondary cycle could be structured to... The rest of the page was calculation. Dense, preliminary, some of it revised so many times the original was barely legible. This was what it looked like at the beginning. This was what it looked like before anything except the question existed. He closed the notebook. He put it back in the box. There was a thing he'd wanted to say to Victoria in that paddock that he hadn't said because the moment had been about other things, and because he wasn't sure it would land right. He'd wanted to say, "You were not entirely wrong about me." He'd spent 6 years at Meridian being good enough but not showing what was underneath it. He'd been waiting for the right conditions, the right certainty, and in the waiting he'd made himself invisible. Some part of what Victoria had seen in that office was real. A man who had not yet proved anything because he'd been holding the proof inside rather than risking it. The firing had removed the option of waiting. He hadn't had the conditions he wanted. He'd had Marcus's garage and a friend's data and the specific extremity of having nothing left to protect except the thing itself. And the thing itself, it turned out, was sufficient. More than sufficient. He didn't think the lesson was that being fired was good, or that difficulty was secretly the point, or any of the clean philosophies that people built around stories like his afterward. The lesson, if there was one, was simpler and harder. He had known what he had, and he had been right, and the only version of the story where it came out well was the one where he kept going. That was it. That was the whole of it. The conditions hadn't mattered, in the end. The engine was the same engine in the garage that it had been in the notebooks, and it was what it was independent of whether anyone had yet recognized it. Lily's newest drawing was on the wall above the desk. She'd made it 2 weeks after Caldwell. The car again, white with blue letters she'd asked Nathan to spell for her, and a figure standing beside it that was identifiably Nathan from the shape of the face, which she'd been drawing the same way since she was 5. The figure had both arms raised. He'd noticed when she gave it to him that this was different from the previous car drawing, where the figure had a wrench. He'd asked her about it. "This one's after," she'd said, as if it were obvious. He looked at the drawing now, in the desk lamp's light. After. He turned off the lamp and went to bed, and the apartment was quiet, and outside the city was doing what it always did, and the notebooks were stacked on the shelf, and the engine was real, and tomorrow the work continued. He slept without the 2 a.m. interruption, which was not a permanent change. He knew himself well enough to know the 2 a.m. brain didn't retire permanently just because the outcome had resolved. It would come back. There would be other calculations, other problems that wanted to be run at hours when the house was dark, and the answers weren't coming. There was a national circuit inquiry and a development ramp and a 7-year-old who was going to grow up and need things he couldn't yet predict. But tonight he slept, and in the morning the engine was still what it was. And that, when you stripped everything else away, was the only thing that had ever actually mattered.